The morning Elizabeth signed her divorce papers, she watched from her car as Richard smugly nailed a for sale sign onto the lawn of their family home, the home her grandmother had left her, the home she'd lovingly renovated for 15 years, the home he'd secretly transferred into his name through a business protection scheme she'd trusted him with. Tears blurred her vision as she gripped the steering wheel, her wedding ring still leaving a pale impression on her finger. But something inside her, a spark that had almost been extinguished through years of subtle manipulation, suddenly ignited into a quiet, determined flame. What would Richard's face look like when he discovered his clever real estate scheme was about to backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable? If you resonate with this tale, please subscribe to our channel, and share your own experiences with overcoming betrayal in the comments below. Elizabeth Martin was more than just the woman Richard had discarded. Long before she became Mrs. Winthrop, she had graduated top of her class from Wharton and built a reputation as one of the most promising financial advisors at Morgan Stanley. Colleagues still spoke of how she could spot market trends before they emerged, like a chess player seeing 5 moves ahead. When she met Richard at a charity gala, she'd been captivated by his confidence and ambition. They married within a year, and Elizabeth had scaled back her 60-hour work weeks to focus on building their life together. She never completely left her career, maintaining a select client list who valued her insight too much to let her go, but her energy shifted to their shared dreams. The Victorian home her grandmother left her became her passion project. Richard built his property development firm. Elizabeth restored the century-old woodwork, researched period-appropriate fixtures, and saved the stained glass windows that the previous generation had nearly destroyed with aluminum siding. She knew every inch of those 3,200 square feet intimately, the way the third stair creaked, how the afternoon light hit the reading nook in the living room, the perfect temperature for the temperamental old radiators. The neighbors noticed her dedication. Mrs. Abernathy, the retired schoolteacher who lived on the corner, often brought over lemonade during Elizabeth's gardening marathons. Together, they'd planted the front yard with native perennials that transformed the once barren lawn into a neighborhood showcase. "You've got the touch, dear," Mrs. Abernathy would say, watching Elizabeth coax reluctant hydrangeas into blooming. "This house was waiting for someone like you." Elizabeth extended that touch beyond her property line. She'd organized the community garden in the vacant lot 2 streets over, converting an eyesore into a gathering place where neighbors grew vegetables and children learned about nature. She helped Mr. Finch, the widower across the street, navigate Medicare forms when his arthritis became too painful for him to type. On Wednesdays, she drove 3 elderly neighbors to their doctor appointments. Maple Street wasn't just her address, it was her community. Richard had always viewed her neighborhood involvement with amused tolerance. "Playing small-town mayor again?" he'd ask when she returned from community meetings. He never understood that these connections were investments of a different kind. His focus remained on the more affluent developments across town, where he was building identical luxury townhomes that sold for 7 figures. Elizabeth's quaint neighborhood, with its mix of young families, retirees, and modest incomes, didn't register on his professional radar until now. Elizabeth wiped away her tears and started the car engine. As she pulled away from the curb, she caught a glimpse of Richard in her rearview mirror, admiring his handiwork with the for sale sign. His phone was already at his ear, likely updating his business partner Craig about their latest acquisition. They had always underestimated her financial acumen, her attention to detail, her quiet determination. Richard thought she'd been too busy selecting paint colors and hosting neighborhood potlucks to notice the paperwork he'd slipped into the stack of documents she'd signed 3 years ago, transferring her inheritance into a holding company that he now solely controlled. He didn't know she'd discovered the truth months ago, when she found the deed during her annual filing. He didn't know she'd been preparing ever since, methodically organizing her resources while pretending everything was normal. He didn't know that while she packed photo albums and kitchen utensils, she'd also been making phone calls to old colleagues who still respected her business mind. Elizabeth checked her watch, just enough time to make her appointment. The Elizabeth that Richard thought he knew would be crying into a glass of wine tonight, mourning the loss of her beloved home, but that Elizabeth no longer existed. This Elizabeth had a plan. The erosion of their marriage had been so gradual that Elizabeth couldn't pinpoint exactly when things changed. Richard had always been charming. That was what had attracted her initially. His confidence, his quick smile, the way he could command a room, but somewhere along the way, that charm had hardened into something else. You should wear the blue dress tonight, he'd suggest before business dinners. The black one makes you look tired. Always couched as concern, never as criticism. Are you sure you want to take on that client? He'd ask when she mentioned expanding her part-time portfolio. You seemed so stressed last quarter. Always framed as protection, never as control. The suggestions became expectations. The helpful comments became veiled judgments. The man who had once boasted about her financial brilliance to friends now interrupted her at dinner parties with, "What Elizabeth means to say is ... She'd accommodated, adjusted, adapted. Made herself smaller, quieter, less confrontational. It seemed easier that way. Peace at any price. When had she stopped recognizing herself? Elizabeth pulled into the parking lot of First Federal Bank and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back had shadows under her eyes, but determination in her gaze. She reached for her portfolio case in the passenger seat, the one Richard had tried to dissuade her from buying. So expensive for something you rarely use anymore. Inside was the evidence of his betrayal. The property transfer documents she'd discovered buried in their home office filing cabinet 3 months ago. The paperwork showing how he'd moved her grandmother's house, her inheritance, into a business holding company that initially listed them both as owners. Then, a year later, another document removing her name, with a signature she barely recognized as her own. She remembered that day. Richard had brought home a stack of papers for their tax preparation. "Just sign where I flagged," he'd said. Distracted by a call. "It's all the standard stuff. I'll get these to the accountant tomorrow." She'd been preoccupied with a plumbing emergency in the upstairs bathroom, water soaking through the ceiling below. She'd signed without reading. A rookie mistake for a former financial advisor. When she confronted him, his response chilled her. More than the betrayal itself. "It's just business, Liz," he'd said, using the nickname she'd always hated. "The house is a significant asset. I needed to protect it from any claims if my business faced litigation. It's still our house, but it wasn't." And when she filed for divorce after discovering text messages between Richard and his much younger assistant Cassandra, she learned exactly what just business meant. The property at 1423 Maple Street is listed as an asset of Winthrop Holdings, LLC. Her lawyer explained gently, Richard is the sole owner of that company now. Legally, the house belongs to him. The law couldn't help her. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed, the one Richard had insisted was just a formality, for his investors protected his business interests. The house she'd renovated with her own hands, the home her grandmother had left specifically to her, was no longer hers. "He can't just take a family inheritance," she protested. Her lawyer's expression had been sympathetic but resigned. "You signed it over, Elizabeth? We can fight, but with these documents?" Elizabeth had left that meeting feeling hollow. 15 years of marriage reduced to a stack of legal documents that stripped her of everything she valued. Not just the house, but her sense of security, her trust, her place in the world. That night, alone in the apartment she'd rented near downtown, she'd allowed herself exactly 1 hour of tears. Then she'd opened her laptop and begun to research what Richard had taught her something valuable after all. Everything was just business. Now, walking into the bank, Elizabeth felt a strange calm. The branch manager, Timothy Cole, rose to greet her. "Mrs. Winthrop, it's been a while." "It's Ms. Martin again, actually," she corrected him. "And yes, it has been. But I'm hoping you can help me with something important." Timothy's expression was guarded. He'd known both Elizabeth and Richard for years, handled their banking personally. "I'll certainly try." Elizabeth placed her portfolio on his desk and removed a document. Not the divorce papers or property transfers, but something else entirely. "I'd like to discuss reactivating my personal accounts and credit lines," she said, "the ones I had before my marriage." Timothy looked surprised. "Those have been dormant for years." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, "but not closed, and my credit score is still excellent." She handed him another document, her latest credit report. "I see," Timothy said, studying the numbers. "And may I ask what?" "This is regarding..." Elizabeth allowed herself a small smile. "Investment opportunity, a significant one." He looked at her with new interest. Before her marriage, Elizabeth's investment acumen had been legendary at First Federal. "Tell me more," he said, leaning forward. "I'll need to move quickly and discreetly," Elizabeth explained. "And I'll need more capital than what I currently have liquid." The meeting lasted 45 minutes. When Elizabeth left, she had preliminary approval for a substantial line of credit, pending final review. It wasn't enough for what she had. Planned not nearly, but it was a start. In her car. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't used in years. Meredith Chang, her former colleague from Morgan Stanley, now partner at an investment firm. The call connected on the third ring. "This is Meredith." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "Meredith, it's Elizabeth Martin. I need your advice on something substantial." There was a pause, then Meredith's voice, warm with recognition. "Elizabeth, my God, it's been forever." "What's this about?" "Real estate," Elizabeth said. "And reclaiming what's mine." The cafe was tucked away on a side street downtown, far enough from Richard's usual haunts that Elizabeth could relax. Sunlight streamed through large windows, casting a warm glow on the reclaimed wood tables. In a corner booth, Meredith Chang was already waiting, 2 coffees on the table. "Still take it black?" Meredith asked as Elizabeth slid into the seat across from her. "Some things never change," Elizabeth replied with a smile. Meredith looked much the same as she had 5 years ago, sleek bob haircut, impeccable suit, the confident posture of someone who routinely managed 9-figure portfolios. They'd started at Morgan Stanley together, shared an apartment for 2 years, then each other's confidants through promotions and breakups. "So," Meredith said after they'd exchanged brief updates, "you mentioned real estate on the phone. I'm intrigued." Elizabeth pulled out a folder and spread several documents on the table: property records, tax assessments, zoning maps of her neighborhood. "What do you see?" she asked. Meredith studied the materials, her analytical mind quickly processing the information. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Interesting. These properties are significantly undervalued for their location and size. The zoning recently changed from strictly residential to mixed use, which the tax assessments haven't caught up with yet." She looked up sharply. "Your neighborhood is sitting on a gold mine." Elizabeth nodded. "Exactly. And almost no one knows it yet." "Almost. Richard does. And his development company." Elizabeth explained about the house, the divorce, the property transfer. "He's already put it on the market, but that's just the beginning. His company has been quietly researching the area for months." Meredith's expression darkened. "What an asshole move." Then her eyes narrowed. "Wait, you're not just here for sympathy, are you? You have something in mind." Elizabeth leaned forward. "What if I could acquire enough properties in the neighborhood to control its development trajectory before Richard and his partners can implement whatever soulless plan they're cooking up?" Meredith let out a low whistle. "That would take serious capital. We're talking millions." "I know. I've run the numbers." Elizabeth slid another document across the table, a detailed spreadsheet showing potential acquisition costs, financing options, and projected returns. "I've got some personal assets and a line of credit, but not nearly enough." Meredith studied the spreadsheet, her expression shifting from skepticism to intrigue. "This is actually solid. You've always had good instincts, but this is impressively thorough." "I've had 3 months to plan," Elizabeth said quietly, "since I found out about the house. Still, it's a huge undertaking. Even if you had the money, acquiring multiple properties quickly without driving up prices is tricky. And you need to move fast before word gets out. That's why I need your help. You have connections. I don't. Investors looking for unique opportunities, people who understand long-term value plays." Meredith tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. "Tell me about Richard's current financial situation." Elizabeth smiled. This was why she'd come to Meredith. She thought like a strategist. He's overextended. His company has 3 luxury developments in progress across town, all financed with significant debt. The market's softening in that price range, too, of his model homes have been sitting unsold for months. She paused, "And he's got a new girlfriend with expensive taste." "The classic downfall," Meredith murmured. "And he doesn't know you're aware of all this?" "Richard thinks I'm too emotional to function right now. Too busy crying over my grandmother's china collection to notice what he's doing." Meredith's smile was sharp. His mistake. She gathered the documents and tucked them into her briefcase. "Let me make some calls. No promises, but this has potential." "Thank you," Elizabeth said, relief washing over her. Just having someone take her seriously felt like a victory. "Don't thank me yet." Meredith's expression was serious. "This is going to get complicated and personal. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Elizabeth thought about the for sale sign on her lawn. Richard's smug face as he hammered it into the ground. I'm already in the complicated and personal part, she replied. At least this way, I'm not just a victim. After Meredith left, Elizabeth remained at the cafe, opening her laptop to continue her research. She pulled up property records for the entire neighborhood, studying ownership patterns, length of residency, recent sales. Then she accessed public records for Richard's development company, Winthrop Properties. What she found made her sit up straighter. Winthrop had recently created a new L. Eaton Maple Street acquisitions. The paperwork was only 2 weeks old, so Richard wasn't just selling her house. He was targeting the entire neighborhood. Elizabeth's phone pinged with a text from Meredith. Can. Meet with Jameson Capital tomorrow at 9. They're interested. Very interested. A flutter of nervous energy ran through her. This was actually happening. On her way home to her rented apartment, Elizabeth drove past her house, not her house anymore. She reminded herself. A young couple was standing on the sidewalk, looking at the property with a real estate agent. The woman pointed excitedly at the front porch swing Elizabeth had installed last summer. Elizabeth forced herself to keep driving she couldn't afford. Emotions right now, this was business. Just business. Back at her apartment, she pulled out a legal pad and began sketching out a strategy. She would need a shell company of her own, something that couldn't be traced back to her. She'd need to approach property owners carefully, strategically, and she'd need to stay under Richard's radar. Her phone rang. Meredith again. I did some digging, her friend said without preamble. Your ex is working with Craig Donovan at Metropolitan Development. They're planning to tear down at least a dozen houses and build luxury condos. Elizabeth's heart sank. Craig Donovan was known for his aggressive tactics and political connections. This would be even harder than she'd thought. How much time do we have? Not much. They're moving fast. But Elizabeth... Meredith paused. I think we can do this. Jameson is very interested in your analysis of the neighborhood's potential. And they've worked with me long enough to trust my judgment. Elizabeth closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of hope. One more thing, Meredith added. If we do this, you can't be visibly involved. Not at first. Richard would shut it down in a heartbeat if he knew you were behind it. I understand, Elizabeth said. I'll be a ghost. After hanging up, she walked to her window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably celebrating his clever real estate scheme, unaware that the first domino in his downfall had just tipped over. The offices of Jameson Capital occupied the 27th floor of a sleek downtown high-rise. Elizabeth smoothed her charcoal gray suit, the power suit she'd worn to close major deals in her previous life, and tried to quiet the doubt gnawing at her confidence. It had been years since she'd pitched to serious investors. Meredith met her in the lobby, looking sharp in navy blue. Ready? She asked. As I'll ever be, Elizabeth replied. Marcus Jameson didn't waste time on small talk. A trim man in his 60s with piercing blue eyes, he gestured for Elizabeth to begin her presentation as soon as introductions were complete. For the next 30 minutes, Elizabeth outlined her analysis of the neighborhood's development potential, the current ownership landscape, and her strategy for selective acquisition. She'd stayed up half the night refining her presentation, and it showed her delivery was crisp, her numbers solid, her responses to questions confident and thoughtful. And your interest in this particular neighborhood? Marcus finally asked. His expression unreadable. Elizabeth had prepared for this question. Meredith had advised complete transparency with Marcus, at least. I lived there for 15 years. My ex-husband now controls my former home through what I consider questionable means, and he's working with Metropolitan Development to transform the neighborhood into luxury condos. Marcus raised an eyebrow. So this is personal? The motivation is personal, Elizabeth acknowledged. The business plan is not. These properties are genuinely undervalued, and there's significant potential for ethical development that preserves the neighborhood's character while providing excellent returns. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then turned to Meredith. Your thoughts? The numbers are solid, Meredith said. And I believe in Elizabeth's judgment. She was one of our top performers at Morgan Stanley before she stepped back. Marcus nodded slowly. I'll need 24 hours to review this more thoroughly. But provisionally, I'm interested, with conditions. Relief flooded through Elizabeth. What conditions? We create a new entity completely separate from you officially. You'll be a silent advisor only. Meredith will be our official representative. He fixed Elizabeth with a stern look. No emotional decisions. If at any point I feel this is becoming more about revenge than sound business, we walk. Understood, Elizabeth said firmly. This isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming what was taken unfairly and protecting a community from predatory development. Marcus's expression softened slightly. I respect that distinction, Ms. Martin. We'll be in touch tomorrow. In the elevator heading down, Meredith squeezed Elizabeth's arm. That went well. Marcus doesn't suffer fools, and he despises time wasters. If he says he's interested, he means it. I can hardly believe it, Elizabeth admitted. When I started this, I wasn't sure anyone would take me seriously. That's what happens when you step away from your career for too long, Meredith said. You forget your own value, but I haven't forgotten how good you are at this. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of anxiety and hope. Elizabeth distracted herself by reaching out to other former colleagues, not about her plan, but simply reconnecting, reminding them she existed. Several expressed surprise at hearing from her after so long. We all wondered what happened to you, said James Pereira, a former client who now ran his own investment consultancy. One day you were the rising star everyone was betting on. The next you'd scaled back to almost nothing. Life happened, Elizabeth said vaguely, but I'm finding my way back. Good, James replied. The field's been less interesting without you. These conversations served a dual purpose, rebuilding her professional network while also establishing alibis. If Richard started asking questions about her activities, he'd hear she was getting back into finance in a general way, nothing specific about real estate. Late the following afternoon, Meredith called. Where go? She said without preamble. Maple Heritage LLC will be incorporated by end of day tomorrow. Marcus is putting in $10 million initially, with another $5 million available if the first acquisitions go well. Elizabeth sat down abruptly, her knees weak with relief. I don't know what to say. Say you're ready to work harder than you've ever worked before, Meredith replied, because this is going to be intense. We need to move quickly but carefully. Over the next week, they assembled a small, discreet team. James Pereira came aboard as their market analyst, his expertise in real estate valuations proving invaluable. Meredith brought in Diane Lewis, a real estate attorney with expertise in complex transactions. The final addition was Tyler Oakes, a personable former real estate agent who would be their front man for approaching property owners. They gathered for their first strategy session in a private conference room. Meredith had booked a downtown hotel in neutral territory, away from curious eyes. Our first challenge, Elizabeth began, is identifying which properties to target initially. We need to be strategic. James nodded, spreading out a map of the neighborhood on the table. I've analyzed recent sales data and property values. These parcels here, he circled several properties, would give us the most leverage for the least investment. Mrs. Abernathy's house is on that list, Elizabeth noted with concern. She's lived there for 40 years, which makes her a prime target for Metropolitan, too, Diane pointed out. Older residents on fixed incomes are typically the first approached when developers move in. We're not forcing anyone to sell, Tyler assured her, but we can offer fair market value, which is more than Metropolitan will likely offer once they start pressuring people. Elizabeth felt conflict churning inside her. This was exactly the kind of aggressive acquisition strategy she was trying to fight against. But if they didn't move quickly, Metropolitan would simply do it anyway, with far less concern for the residents. What if we offered Mrs. Abernathy and others like her an option to sell with a leaseback provision? She suggested. They get the value of their property now, but can continue living there at affordable rent. Diane looked thoughtful. It's unorthodox, but legally sound, and it would give us control of the properties while protecting vulnerable residents. I like it, Meredith said. It aligns with our stated mission of ethical development. By the end of the meeting, they had identified 10 initial properties to approach, developed scripts for Tyler to use when contacting owners, and established a secure communication protocol. Elizabeth would remain in the background, officially, uninvolved but guiding their strategy as they gathered their materials. Tyler asked the question Elizabeth had been dreading. What about your house? The one your ex now controls? All eyes turned to her. We leave it for now, she said firmly. He's already listed it, and showing interest too soon would tip our hand. We focus on properties he doesn't yet know are valuable. Meredith studied her with concern. Can you handle watching someone else buy it? Elizabeth squared her shoulders. I have to. This is bigger than just my house now. As the team dispersed, Elizabeth felt a strange mix of emotions, determination, anxiety, excitement, and underneath it all, a simmering anger she worked hard to contain. Marcus was right to be concerned about her emotional involvement. She would need to guard against letting personal feelings cloud her judgment. But as she drove past her old house on the way back to her apartment and saw a new couple touring the garden she'd so lovingly created, she allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, the look on Richard's face when he finally realized what was happening. That wasn't just emotion, she decided. That was motivation. Mrs. Eleanor Abernathy's Victorian home stood on the corner of Maple and Elm, its gingerbread trim and wraparound porch a testament to an earlier era. Like many houses in the neighborhood, it showed signs of aging peeling paint, a slightly sagging porch step, but the garden bloomed with well-tended roses, and lace curtains hung perfectly in the windows. Elizabeth hesitated at the gate, uncertain of her approach. Mrs. Abernathy had been her first friend when she'd moved into her grandmother's house 15 years ago. The retired schoolteacher had brought over homemade blueberry pie and offered gardening advice that Elizabeth, a city girl with no knowledge of plants, had desperately needed. Now Elizabeth was here with an ulterior motive, and the guilt weighed heavily. Before she could reconsider, the front door opened, and Mrs. Abernathy appeared, still spry at 78. "Elizabeth Martin, I was wondering when you'd come see me." Her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. "Don't just stand there, come in and have some tea." The interior of the house was like stepping back in time, not because it was outdated, but because it was so perfectly preserved. Original hardwood floors gleamed beneath antique rugs. Family photographs in silver frames documented generations of Abernathys. Richards put up a for sale sign, Mrs. Abernathy said as she poured tea into delicate china cups. "Shameful business, that?" Elizabeth nearly choked on her first sip. "You know about that?" "My dear, I may be old, but I'm not deaf. Or blind. Maple Street talks." She set down the teapot with a decisive clink. "That young man always did think he was cleverer than he is." Despite her anxiety, Elizabeth smiled. Mrs. Abernathy had never been Richard's biggest fan. "I'm not here about my house, actually," Elizabeth began carefully. "I wanted to ask if you've had any approaches from developers or real estate agents." Mrs. Abernathy's expression turned shrewd. "3 in the past month. Most recently, a very smooth-talking young man from Metropolitan Development told me how I could unlock the value in my home." She snorted. "As if I don't know what that means. Take my money and run before they tear down everything, my Herbert." "And I built." Elizabeth's heart sank. Metropolitan was moving even faster than she'd feared. "What did you tell them?" "Told them I'd think about it," Mrs. Abernathy said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "I'm not ready to decide anything yet. But I'm not a fool, Elizabeth. I know what's happening. This neighborhood is changing." She gazed out the window at the street where she'd lived for 4 decades. "I just don't want to be forced out before I'm ready." Elizabeth took a deep breath. What if there was another option? One that would let you stay in your home, but still give you financial security? Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose. "I'm listening." Carefully, Elizabeth outlined the lease-back concept they developed, how Mrs. Abernathy could sell her home, but continue living in it, with guarantee affordable rent for as long as she wished. "And who exactly would I be selling to?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, her gaze sharp. Elizabeth hesitated. Tyler was supposed to be the public face of their operation. She wasn't supposed to be directly involved, but this was Mrs. Abernathy, who taught her how to prune roses and brought her soup when she had the flu. "A company called Maple Heritage LLC," she said. "They're interested in preserving the character of the neighborhood while allowing for sensible development." "And you're involved with this company?" It wasn't really a question. Elizabeth met her eyes. "I'm advising them, unofficially." Mrs. Abernathy nodded slowly. "Because of what Richard did." "Partly," Elizabeth admitted, "but also because I care about this neighborhood. I don't want to see it turned into another soulless luxury development." Mrs. Abernathy was silent for a long moment, sipping her tea thoughtfully. "You know, when Metropolitan came calling, the first thing I thought was, what would Elizabeth advise me to do? You always were the sensible one." Elizabeth felt a lump forming in her throat. "I don't want to pressure you." "That's exactly what we're trying to fight against." "Oh, hush. Telling me my options isn't pressure." Mrs. Abernathy set down her teacup. "Let me think on it." But I'll tell you this, I'd rather work with someone who cares about Maple Street than those slick characters from Metropolitan. As Elizabeth was leaving, Mrs. Abernathy called her back. That young man from Metropolitan mentioned your house specifically, she said. Said it was the first step in their neighborhood revitalization plan. Said they already had a buyer lined up, someone who understands the vision for the area. Elizabeth felt cold. Did he mention who? No, but he implied it was someone important. An investor with deep pockets? Mrs. Abernathy's expression was troubled. Elizabeth, they're not just buying houses. They're buying influence. The mayor's office is suddenly very interested in redevelopment initiatives for our district. This was worse than Elizabeth had imagined. Metropolitan wasn't just planning a few luxury condos, they were orchestrating a complete takeover with political backing. Thank you for telling me, she said, her mind already racing with the implications. Be careful, Mrs. Abernathy warned. Richard always was a sore loser. If he realizes you're behind this ... He won't, Elizabeth assured her. As far as he knows, I'm licking my wounds and starting over in finance. Mrs. Abernathy smiled sadly. You never were very good at licking wounds. More the type to come back fighting. 2 days later, Tyler called with news. Mrs. Abernathy wants to meet. Says she's ready to discuss terms, but will only talk to you directly. Elizabeth wasn't surprised. Set it up, and Tyler ... We need to move faster. Metropolitan already has political support and a buyer for my house. Understood. I've got appointments with 3 more homeowners tomorrow. The Finches are very interested, and the Ramirez family is considering our offer. That evening, Elizabeth drove past her old house again, a habit she couldn't seem to break. The for sale sign now had a pending banner across it. Her stomach clenched at the sight. Whoever was buying it was part of Metropolitan's larger plan. She was losing her home, but she was determined not to lose the war. Mrs. Abernathy's decision to work with them was the first real victory. One property secured, many more to go. As she pulled away, her phone buzzed with a text from Meredith. Big news. Call me ASAP. Elizabeth found a place to park and dialed immediately. We've identified Metropolitan's primary investor, Meredith said without preamble. You're not going to like it. Who? Westlake Partners. Meredith paused. Where your ex-wife works. Elizabeth stared out the windshield in shock. Catherine is backing Metropolitan's development. Looks that way. Which means this just got a lot more complicated. Elizabeth closed her eyes, absorbing this new twist. Catherine Benson Winthrop, Richard's first wife and Elizabeth's predecessor. The successful investment banker who divorced Richard after 10 years of marriage, walking away with a substantial settlement. Elizabeth had always assumed Catherine disliked Richard as much as she now did. Apparently, business made for strange. Bedfellows, keep ticking, she told Meredith. I need to know exactly what we're up against. As she hung up, Elizabeth caught sight of a familiar car turning onto the street, Richard's black Mercedes. Instinctively, she slouched down in her seat, watching as he pulled into the driveway of what had once been their home. He wasn't alone. A striking blonde Cassandra, presumably, emerged from the passenger side, followed by a man in an expensive suit whom Elizabeth recognized as Craig Donovan, Metropolitan's CEO. They stood in the driveway, gesturing toward the house and the surrounding properties, clearly discussing plans. Richard looked pleased with himself, pointing toward Mrs. Abernathy's corner lot with particular emphasis. Elizabeth took out her phone and snapped several photos. Evidence of their collaboration might prove useful later. As she watched them laugh and plan, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her house anymore. It was about protecting an entire community from people who saw it only as dollar signs on a balance sheet, starting with Mrs. Abernathy's corner Victorian. She would build a wall they couldn't breach, property by property. Cassandra Bell crossed her long legs and sipped her martini, observing the upscale restaurant with the practiced eye of someone assessing the competition. At 29, she was the youngest executive assistant Richard had ever hired, and the only one he'd started dating immediately after his divorce proceedings began. The ceviche here is divine, she told Richard, who was distracted by his phone. You should try it. He glanced up briefly. Sure, whatever you want. Cassandra suppressed her irritation. Richard had been increasingly preoccupied lately, constantly checking emails and taking calls about the Maple Street project. She'd initially found his ambition attractive, that and his Patek Philippe watch. custom suits, and corner office with a view. Now, 3 months into their relationship, she was discovering that being a developer's girlfriend meant a lot of interrupted dinners. Craig thinks we should increase our initial offer to the Ramirez family, Richard said, finally setting down his phone. They're apparently hesitating. Shocking that people might not want to give up their homes, Cassandra murmured. Richard shot her a sharp look. They're sitting on undervalued assets. We're offering fair market value. Of course, she agreed. Smoothly, she'd learned to pick her battles with Richard. Tell me more about the plans for Maple Street. You mentioned condos? His expression brightened, as it always did when discussing the project. Not just condos. A complete neighborhood. Transformation. Mixed-use development with high-end retail on the ground floors, luxury residences above. We're calling it the Maples, classic-inspired architecture with modern amenities. Sounds lovely, Cassandra said, taking another sip of her martini. And your ex-wife's house will be part of this? A smug smile crossed Richard's face. Phase 1. It's perfect for our model unit. Good bones, excellent curb appeal. Elizabeth always did have an eye for aesthetics, even if her business sense was lacking. Cassandra had heard endless comments about Elizabeth's shortcomings, her old-fashioned values, her preoccupation with the neighborhood, her naive trust. She'd initially dismissed them as typical ex-husband bitterness, but lately she'd begun to wonder. Richard's tone when discussing Elizabeth contained something beyond the usual, post-divorce rancor, something that sounded almost like fear beneath the contempt. Had you heard from her recently? She asked casually. Why would I? Richard signaled. The waiter for another scotch. She's moved on. Probably crying into her pillow every night. But that's not my problem. Of course not, Cassandra agreed, though she wondered if he really believed that. In her experience, women like Elizabeth, from the little she'd heard, didn't simply collapse when wronged. They planned. Their appetizers arrived temporarily, diverting Richard's attention. Cassandra used the opportunity to observe him more critically. He was handsome in a conventional way, salt and pepper hair, strong jaw, the confident posture of someone used to being listened to. But lately she'd noticed signs of strain, the tightness around his eyes, the way he startled at unexpected noises. Craig mentioned some unusual activity in the real estate market. She ventured when he seemed relaxed again. Something about another buyer showing interest in the area? Richard's expression darkened. Nothing to worry about. Some small-time investor thinking they can flip a few properties before we move in. They'll back off once they realize who they're dealing with. And who's that exactly? Cassandra asked innocently. Richard didn't answer immediately, distracted by a couple being seated at a nearby table. Cassandra followed his gaze and noticed his sudden tension. What is it? She asked. Nothing, he said too quickly. Just thought. I recognized someone, but his good mood had evaporated. He checked his watch and signaled for the check before they'd even ordered entrees. We should get going. I have an early meeting tomorrow. In the car, Richard's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and answered immediately. Craig, what's up? He listened intently, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. When did this happen? ... Are you sure? No, that can't be right. She doesn't have that kind of capital. Cassandra pretended to check her own phone, ears straining to catch. A conversation. Look into it more deeply, Richard was saying. I want to know exactly who's behind Maple Heritage LLC. There's no way it's a coincidence. After hanging up, he drove in tense silence, his earlier swagger replaced by a coiled anxiety that filled the car like a storm cloud. Bad news? Cassandra finally asked. Nothing I can't handle, he replied curtly. Just some complications with the Maple Street acquisitions. She waited, knowing he needed to vent to someone. The old lady on the corner lot, Abernathy, just sold her property to some company called Maple Heritage. Claims they're focused on preserving neighborhood character or some such nonsense. His voice dripped with derision, as if that decrepit Victorian has any real value beyond the land it sits on. Couldn't you still buy it from this Maple Heritage company? That's not the point, Richard snapped. It's about control. We need contiguous parcels for the development to work as planned. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. Something about this doesn't add up. This company appears out of nowhere, targeting the exact properties we're interested in. Cassandra studied his profile, noting the genuine concern beneath the bluster. You don't think ... Elizabeth? He barked out a laugh. Please, she's got neither the money nor the business acumen for something like this. Last I heard, she's trying to restart her finance career, probably managing retirement accounts for old ladies. They pulled into the driveway of Richard's downtown penthouse, the city lights glittering below them. As he shut off the engine, Richard seemed to make a decision. I need to make some calls, business stuff. His dismissal was clear, of course. Cassandra gathered her purse, hiding her irritation behind a practiced smile. I'll call an Uber. I'll make it up to you this weekend, he promised, already scrolling through his contacts. We'll go to that new place you mentioned. Cassandra nodded and stepped out of the car. As she waited for her ride, she watched Richard pace on his balcony, phone pressed to his ear, gesticulating emphatically. Something had him genuinely worried in the 3 months she'd been with Richard. She'd seen many sides of him: charming, ambitious, occasionally thoughtful, increasingly controlling. But this was the first time she'd seen him afraid. Her Uber arrived, and as she settled into the back seat, she made a mental note to learn more about Elizabeth Martin. Perhaps Richard's ex-wife was more interesting than he'd led her to believe. The next morning, Cassandra arrived at the office early. As Richard's executive assistant, she had access to all his files, including those related to his divorce. She wasn't proud of snooping, but Richard's reaction last night had piqued her curiosity. The divorce documents painted a very different picture than Richard's dismissive comments. Elizabeth Martin had been a rising star at Morgan Stanley before scaling back her career. She'd brought the Maple Street house into the marriage as an inheritance, and the property transfer that put it in Richard's name had occurred under questionable circumstances. Cassandra sat back in her chair, considering this information with new eyes. If she had been Elizabeth's position betrayed, manipulated, cheated on, she wouldn't be crying into her pillow. She'd be plotting revenge. Her desk phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Richard Winthrop's office, she answered smoothly. Cassandra? It's Craig Donovan. Is Richard in yet? Not yet. Can I take a message? Tell him to call me immediately. We've got a problem. Another property on Maple Street just sold, the Finch place. Same buyer, Maple Heritage LLC. As Cassandra hung up, she found herself smiling slightly. Perhaps the Maple Street project was about to become far more interesting than anyone had anticipated, especially Richard. The private dining room at Le Bernardin was hushed, the kind of quiet that spoke of money and discretion. Elizabeth smoothed her navy silk dress, a purchase she'd agonized over, but that Meredith had insisted was necessary for this meeting. Appearance matters, her friend had reminded her, especially with investors of this caliber. Elizabeth checked her watch nervously. She was early by design. Meredith would arrive with their mysterious potential investor momentarily, Marcus. Jameson's initial funding had been critical in securing the first properties, but to truly compete with Metropolitan's resources, they needed a major influx of capital. When Meredith had mentioned a potential angel investor who wanted to meet Elizabeth personally, she'd been both hopeful and suspicious. Who is it? She'd asked repeatedly. Someone who prefers to remain anonymous until they've made a decision, Meredith had replied. Trust me on this, Elizabeth. It's worth the mystery. The door opened and Meredith entered, elegant in a charcoal pantsuit. Behind her came a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair, impeccably dressed in a cream suit that probably cost more than Elizabeth's car. Elizabeth froze, recognition dawning immediately. Hello, Elizabeth, said Catherine Benson Winthrop, Richard's first wife. It's been a while. Meredith looked between them, her expression carefully neutral. I see introductions won't be necessary. Not at all, Catherine said, taking a seat across from Elizabeth. Though we've only met a few times at charity functions when Richard was transitioning between marriages. Her tone was dry, without obvious malice, but Elizabeth still felt a flush of embarrassment. She'd never been comfortable around Catherine, the successful, sophisticated first wife who seemed to represent everything Elizabeth wasn't. I believe you have questions, Catherine continued, signaling the waiter for wine. Meredith certainly did when she realized who was behind Westlake Partners. Elizabeth found her voice. You're backing Metropolitan's development in my neighborhood. Now you want to invest in our competing project. Forgive me if I'm confused. Catherine's smile was enigmatic. Westlake Partners has indeed made an initial investment in Metropolitan's proposal. However, I've recently received information that has altered my perspective on the project. What kind of information? The kind that suggests Richard and Craig Donovan aren't being entirely forthcoming with their investors. Catherine accepted. A glass of wine from the waiter, waiting until he withdrew before continuing. They've misrepresented both the acquisition costs and the community support for their development. Elizabeth leaned forward. And you care about community support? I care about accurate information when I'm investing 8 figures, Catherine replied coolly. But since you ask, yes, I do find their scorched earth approach to neighborhood development distasteful. Profitable, but distasteful. Meredith cleared her throat. Catherine reached out to me after doing some due diligence on Maple Heritage LLC. She was impressed with our strategy. And intrigued by who might be behind it, Catherine added, her gaze direct. It didn't take much digging to find your fingerprints. Elizabeth, you've been discreet, but not invisible. Elizabeth felt a chill. If you figured it out, Richard could too. Richard doesn't have my resources or attention to detail. But yes, eventually he'll realize. Catherine sipped her wine thoughtfully. Which is why, if we proceed, we'll need to move quickly and decisively. If we proceed, Elizabeth repeated. You haven't explained why you would switch sides. You and Richard have been divorced for years, but you're still backing his projects. Why change now? Catherine set down her glass, her expression hardening slightly. Richard and I maintained a professional relationship after our divorce. It was ... convenient. But convenient doesn't mean I trust him. She paused. And I dislike being lied to about investment projections. There was something more, Elizabeth sensed. Something personal beneath the business rationale. And, she prompted, Catherine's composure slipped, just for a moment. And I recognize his pattern. What he did to you with the house. He did something similar to me with our summer property in the Hamptons. Different method, same result. She straightened her silverware, a small tell of agitation. I let it go at the time. I had other priorities, but I haven't forgotten. The waiter returned to take their orders. When he departed, Catherine continued, her business-like demeanor restored. I'm prepared to invest $20 million in Maple Heritage, with an option for an additional 10 based on progress. In return, I want a 30% stake and input on the final development plan. Elizabeth glanced at Meredith, who gave a slight nod. The terms were within their acceptable range. And complete anonymity, Elizabeth added. Your involvement remains confidential until we've secured a controlling interest in the neighborhood. Naturally, Catherine agreed. I have no desire to show my hand prematurely. Why meet with me at all, then? Elizabeth asked. Meredith could have handled everything. Catherine studied her with unexpected intensity. Because I wanted to see for myself what kind of woman takes on Richard Winthrop and metropolitan development simultaneously. Whether you were motivated by emotion or strategy. She smiled slightly. I'm pleased to find it's both. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. Emotion without strategy is ineffective. Strategy without emotional investment lacks staying power. Catherine raised her glass slightly. You have both. That makes you formidable. The rest of the dinner proceeded with detailed discussion of acquisition targets, timelines, and contingency plans. Catherine's business acumen was evident in her incisive questions and suggestions. By dessert, they had outlined an aggressive strategy to secure key properties before Metropolitan could react as they prepared to leave. Catherine held Elizabeth back for a private word. There's something you should know, she said quietly. Richard is more desperate for this development to succeed than he's letting on. His last 2 projects have underperformed significantly. He's leveraged to the hilt. Elizabeth absorbed this information. That explains the rush to sell my house. Indeed. If Maple Street falls through, he could face serious financial difficulties. Catherine's expression was unreadable. Just something to consider in your planning. Thank you for telling me. Catherine gathered her purse, then hesitated. He underestimated. Me too, during our divorce. Thought I was too busy with my career to notice what he was doing. A pattern, Elizabeth observed, one he's yet to break. Catherine extended her hand. I look forward to our partnership, Elizabeth. As Elizabeth watched Catherine's town car pull away, Meredith joined her on the sidewalk. Well, Meredith asked, what do you think? I think Richard has no idea what's coming for him, Elizabeth replied. And I think Catherine Benson Winthrop is possibly the most terrifying ally we could have found. Meredith laughed. Wait until you see her in action at board meetings. Makes sharks look cuddly. She glanced at Elizabeth with concern. Are you okay with this? It's a lot to process. Elizabeth thought about the meeting, the unexpected alliance with Richard's ex-wife. The significant capital now at their disposal, the accelerated timeline that would unfold. "I'm more than okay," she said finally. "For the first time since I found that deed, I believe we might actually win." Later that night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She sat at her apartment window, looking out at the city lights, thinking about Catherine's parting words about Richard's financial troubles. Her phone pinged with a text from Tyler. "Ramirez family accepting our offer. Paperwork tomorrow. That makes 4 properties secured." Elizabeth smiled. 4 down, many more to go. But with Catherine's backing, the impossible suddenly seemed achievable. Property by property, they were building a wall around her old house. A wall that would eventually close in on Richard like a trap. She just hoped she could maintain the secrecy of her involvement long enough to spring it. The conference room at Jameson Capital buzzed with energized conversation. 6 weeks had passed since Catherine's investment, and the results were undeniable. A large neighborhood map dominated the wall, with color-coded pins marking properties. Blue for those secured by Maple Heritage, red for Metropolitan's acquisitions, yellow for pending negotiations, and white for those still untouched. The blue pins outnumbered the red by a significant margin. "The Douglases signed yesterday," Tyler reported, adding another blue pin to the map. "That makes 12 properties under our control, including 3 critical corner lots. Metropolitan has only managed to secure 5, Diane added, including Elizabeth's former house and 2 adjacent properties." Elizabeth studied the map with satisfaction. Their strategy was working. They prioritized properties that created a patchwork pattern throughout the neighborhood, making it increasingly difficult for Metropolitan to assemble the contiguous blocks they needed for their development plan. "What about the Chen property?" Marcus asked. "That's a key parcel for both plans." Tyler grimaced. "Still negotiating. Mr. Chen is reluctant to sell to anyone. His family has owned that hardware store for 3 generations. We don't necessarily need him to sell," Elizabeth pointed out. "We could offer a partnership instead, incorporate his store into our development plan as an anchor business. Preserve the legacy while giving him financial upside." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Creative. That kind of flexible approach is why we're outmaneuvering Metropolitan." The meeting continued with updates on financing, zoning applications, and community relations. Elizabeth remained officially a consultant to the project, but her influence shaped every decision. The team had coalesced around her vision of ethical development, preserving neighborhood character while allowing for sensible growth. After the meeting, Elizabeth checked her watch. She had just enough time to make it to her afternoon appointment. She'd recently accepted a position with a boutique financial advisory firm, working part-time while she focused on the Maple Street project. The double life was exhausting but necessary, both financially and as cover for her real activities. As she drove across town, her phone rang. Meredith's name flashed on the screen. "Turn on KXRB News," Meredith said without preamble. "Richards giving a press conference about the Maple Street development." Elizabeth quickly switched on the radio, catching Richard mid-sentence. Revitalization project that will transform an underserved area into a vibrant mixed-use community," he was saying, his voice smooth and confident. "Metropolitan Development is proud to partner with the city on this important initiative." The mayor spoke next, her enthusiasm evident. "This kind of private investment is exactly what we need to rejuvenate our historic neighborhoods while creating jobs and expanding our tax base." Elizabeth gripped the steering wheel tighter, anger rising. "They're making it sound like a done deal." "It's a pressure tactic," Meredith replied. "They're trying to create momentum, make holdout property owners feel like resistance is futile." "What about the zoning commission? They can't proceed without approvals." "That's the concerning part." The mayor mentioned streamlining the approval process for projects that align with the city's development goals. Elizabeth frowned. "They're trying to bypass normal channels." "Exactly. Richard's pulling political strings. We need to counter this fast." By the time Elizabeth reached her office, she'd outlined a response strategy with Meredith. They would need to take their plan public sooner than intended, positioning Maple Heritage as the community-friendly alternative to Metropolitan's corporate development. Throughout her afternoon client meetings, Elizabeth struggled to stay focused. Her mind kept returning to Richard's smug voice on the radio, the way he positioned himself as the neighborhood's savior rather than its destroyer. That evening, she drove to Mrs. Abernathy's house, still Mrs. Abernathy's house though now, technically owned by Maple Heritage with a lifetime leaseback arrangement. Several neighbors had gathered in the living room, concern evident on their faces. "We heard the mayor's announcement," Mr. Finch said, his arthritic hands clutching a teacup. "Are they going to force us out?" "Absolutely not," Elizabeth assured him. "That's why we've been working so hard to secure properties through Maple Heritage. Metropolitan can make all the announcements they want, but they can't build if they don't control the land." "But the city has eminent domain," Mrs. Ramirez pointed out. "Couldn't they force sales if they declare it a redevelopment zone?" Elizabeth exchanged glances with Tyler, who had accompanied her. This was indeed their greatest vulnerability. "It's possible," she acknowledged, "but extremely difficult politically, especially for transferring property from individual homeowners to a private developer. There would be significant legal challenges and terrible publicity," Tyler added. "No mayor wants to be seen evicting families from their homes to build luxury condos." The informal community meeting continued for another hour, with Elizabeth answering questions and reassuring nervous residents. By the end, most seemed cautiously optimistic about Maple Heritage's alternative vision. As the neighbors departed, Mrs. Abernathy held Elizabeth back. "You didn't tell them everything," the older woman observed shrewdly, "about who's really behind Maple Heritage." Elizabeth sighed. "It's complicated, Eleanor. The fewer people who know my involvement, the better, at least for now. And if Richard discovers it, then we'll deal with that when it happens." Elizabeth checked her phone, finding 3 missed calls from Meredith. "I need to go. Are you okay?" Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand. "I'm more than okay, dear. I'm enjoying watching you outfox that ex-husband of yours. Just be careful. Men like Richard don't lose gracefully." Outside, Elizabeth returned Meredith's calls. "We've got another problem," Meredith said tersely. "Someone's been asking questions about Maple Heritage's funding structure. Trying to identify our major investors." Elizabeth felt a chill. "Richard?" "Not directly. A private investigator, according to my sources. Very discreet, very thorough." "How close are they?" "Too close for comfort. They've already traced some connections back to Jameson Capital." Elizabeth got into her car, mind racing. "We need to accelerate the timeline. How quickly can we move on the remaining priority properties? With Catherine's full backing?" "Very quickly. But it will mean going public with at least part of our plan." "Do it," Elizabeth decided. "Richard's already taken that step. We can't afford to stay in the shadows any longer." The next morning, Elizabeth woke to news alerts on her phone. Maple Heritage LLC had issued a press release outlining their community-centered development vision for the Maple Street area, emphasizing preservation of historic structures, affordable housing components, and sustainable design. Local media picked up the story immediately, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle between competing visions for the neighborhood. Social media buzzed with residents expressing support for Maple Heritage's approach. Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before the reality of their new public position sank in. They'd shown their hand, not completely, but enough. That Richard would recognize a coordinated opposition rather than random market forces. How long before he started asking the right questions? Her phone rang. Tyler again. "The Chen family reached out," he said excitedly. "They saw the press release and want to discuss partnership options. They specifically mentioned liking our commitment to preserving neighborhood businesses." "That's fantastic," Elizabeth replied, genuine relief in her voice. The hardware store was a strategic property, and securing it would be a significant win. "There's more," Tyler continued. 2 other property owners contacted us this morning. Word is spreading about the competing plans, and people are choosing sides. The domino effect was accelerating. Property by property, Maple Heritage was building a coalition that would make Metropolitan's grand plans impossible. Elizabeth could almost picture Richard's frustration as he realized the neighborhood was slipping through his fingers, but as she prepared for her day, a nagging worry persisted. Richard wasn't one to accept defeat gracefully, and he still controlled the one property she cared about most personally, the house her grandmother had left her, the home she poured 15 years of love into, the house that now represented the centerpiece of a battle much larger than their divorce. As if on cue, her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. Clever move with the press release. "We should talk. Lunch today?" Elizabeth stared at the message, her heart pounding. Richard had made the connection faster than she'd anticipated. The question now was, what would he do with that knowledge? And more importantly, what would she do with his unexpected invitation? Elizabeth deliberately chose a restaurant downtown, far from both her apartment and Richard's office-neutral territory for their unexpected encounter. She arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table with a clear view of the entrance and exits. Old habits from her finance days. Always position yourself strategically in negotiations. And this was absolutely a negotiation. Though she wasn't yet sure what Richard was offering or asking for, she consulted with Meredith before accepting his invitation. It's a risk, Meredith had cautioned, but also an opportunity to gauge how much he knows. Elizabeth smoothed her silk blouse and checked her reflection in her phone camera. She looked composed, professional, not at all like someone waging a secret real estate war against her ex-husband. Richard arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He spotted her immediately, his practiced smile faltering slightly as he approached. "Elizabeth," he said, taking the seat across from her. "You look well. Thank you." She kept her tone neutral. "You wanted to talk?" Richard's eyebrows rose slightly at her directness. "No pleasantries?" "We were married for 15 years and divorced for 6 months," she replied, "during which you sold my grandmother's house out from under me. I think we're past pleasantries." He had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable before his smooth facade returned. "Business is business, Liz, nothing personal." "It's Elizabeth," she corrected. "And selling someone's family home feels rather personal from where I'm sitting." The waiter arrived, temporarily halting their conversation. Richard ordered a scotch, neat. Elizabeth chose sparkling water. She needed complete clarity for whatever was coming next. "I was surprised by Maple Heritage's announcement," Richard said after the waiter departed. "Their vision for the neighborhood is quite specific." Elizabeth maintained a neutral expression. "The market allows for competition. Metropolitan isn't the only company with development ideas." "Of course," Richard agreed, studying her carefully. "Though the timing is interesting, and their focus on preserving neighborhood character sounds familiar, almost like something you would say." "Many people value historic neighborhoods," Elizabeth replied evenly. "Not everyone shares your vision of tearing everything down to build luxury condos." Richard leaned back, his expression calculating. "Let's not play games, Elizabeth. I know you're involved with Maple Heritage." She took a sip of water, buying herself a moment. "What makes you think that?" "Because I know you. Your fingerprints are all over their proposal. The community garden expansion, the affordable housing for seniors, the preservation of architectural heritage. It's practically a love letter to your neighborhood obsession." The waiter returned with their drinks. Elizabeth waited until he left before responding. "If you know me so well, you should have anticipated I wouldn't just roll over when you stole my house." Richard's expression hardened. "I didn't steal anything. Everything was legally documented." "Legal doesn't equal ethical, Richard. But you've never been particularly concerned with that distinction." He took a substantial swallow of his scotch. "So you admit you're behind Maple Heritage?" "I didn't say that," Elizabeth replied carefully. "I'm simply pointing out that your development plan has significant opposition, which shouldn't surprise you given your approach." Richard studied her, frustration evident in the tightening of his jaw. She'd forgotten that particular tell, the way his right temple pulsed slightly when he was angry but trying to hide it. "You know," he said, his tone falsely casual, "I'm actually impressed. If you are involved hypothetically, it shows more business acumen than I gave you credit for." "How generous of you," Elizabeth replied dryly. "But," he continued, leaning forward, "you're out of your depth. Metropolitan has resources you can't imagine. Backing from major investors, political support, decades of development experience. And yet Maple Heritage has secured more properties in 6 weeks than Metropolitan has in 3 months," Elizabeth observed, allowing herself a small smile. "Hypothetically speaking, of course," Richard's expression darkened. "A temporary advantage. This isn't a game for amateurs, Elizabeth. Development projects require specialized knowledge, political connections, substantial capital, all of which can be acquired or hired," she interrupted. "No one is born knowing how to build condominiums, Richard. Not even you." The conversation paused as the waiter returned to take their lunch orders. Elizabeth wasn't hungry but ordered a salad anyway. This meeting was about maintaining appearances. "How's the apartment?" Richard asked when they were alone again, his tone deliberately casual. Must be quite an adjustment after the house. The calculated cruelty of the question stung, but Elizabeth kept her expression neutral. Change can be refreshing. I've embraced downsizing, less to clean. Always the optimist, Richard said with a faint smirk. Still, if you're struggling financially, there are options. My company is always looking for experienced financial consultants. Elizabeth nearly choked on her water. Are you offering me a job? Why not? You clearly understand real estate potential, even if your development philosophy is misguided. We could use someone with your community connections. The audacity was breathtaking. Let me be sure I understand, Elizabeth said. Slowly. You want me to come work for the company that's developing the house you took from me? Richard shrugged. It would resolve the conflict. You'd benefit from Metropolitan's success instead of fighting a losing battle against it. That's your offer? Surrender and join the winning team? I prefer to see it as a mutually beneficial resolution, Richard replied. Your neighborhood knowledge combined with our development expertise and capital. Elizabeth studied him, suddenly seeing the truth behind the offer. You're worried, she realized. Maple Heritage is causing real problems for your project, and you're trying to neutralize the threat. Richard's smile disappeared. Don't overestimate your position, Elizabeth. One press release and a few property acquisitions don't make you a serious competitor. 12 properties, she corrected him, at last count, including 3 critical corner lots you need for your development footprint. His eyes narrowed. So you are involved. Elizabeth realized her mistake too late. In her satisfaction at highlighting their progress, she had revealed more specific knowledge than a casual observer would have. I keep up with local real estate news, she said, but the damage was done. Richard's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then stood abruptly. I need to take this. We'll continue our conversation another time. Elizabeth watched him walk away, taking his call near the restaurant entrance. From his gestures and expression, it wasn't good news. After a few minutes, he returned, his earlier smugness replaced by barely contained anger. Lunch will have to wait, he said tightly. Something's come. Up at the office. Problem with the Maple Street development? Elizabeth asked innocently. Richard gave her a hard look. This isn't over, Elizabeth. Metropolitan doesn't lose. First time for everything, she replied as he strode out of the restaurant. Elizabeth released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The confrontation had been inevitable, but now Richard knew for certain she was involved with Maple Heritage. The game had changed. She took out her phone and texted Meredith. He knows. Time for phase 2. Meredith's response came quickly. Catherine's ready. Meeting at 3 p.m. to finalize next steps. Elizabeth paid for the untouched lunch and walked out. Into the sunshine. Richard's attempt to intimidate her had accomplished the opposite. It had confirmed they were succeeding. Metropolitan was worried enough to try buying her compliance, which meant Maple Heritage was winning. Elizabeth pulled into the community garden parking lot, anxiety tightening her chest. The message from Mrs. Ramirez had been urgent. Metropolitan people at the garden. They have city officials with them. Please come. The small lot was crowded, with unfamiliar vehicles, 2 SUVs with Metropolitan Development logos, a CityWorks truck, and a sleek black car Elizabeth recognized as Craig Donovan's Audi. She grabbed her phone and quickly texted Diane, their legal counsel, Metropolitan, at community garden with city officials. Need legal backup ASAP. The community garden had been Elizabeth's passion project for years. What had started as an unused vacant lot had transformed into 3 acres of vegetable beds, flower gardens, a small orchard, and a playground. Families tended individual plots, growing everything from tomatoes to exotic herbs. Children from the nearby elementary school visited weekly for science lessons. Seniors from the neighborhood taught gardening classes to younger residents. It was the heart of the community and apparently Metropolitan's next target. As Elizabeth approached, she heard Craig Donovan's booming voice. The environmental assessment is just a formality. We've already discussed the rezoning with the planning department. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, watching anxiously as Craig pointed out features of the garden to 2 men in suits carrying clipboards. Elizabeth recognized one as Alan Peterson, the city's deputy director of urban development. Mrs. Ramirez spotted Elizabeth and hurried over, her face tight with worry. They're saying the city never properly designated this as a community space. She explained quickly that it's still zoned as vacant commercial land that can be sold for development. Elizabeth felt a surge of anger. The garden had operated with the city's blessing for over a decade. While they didn't have formal ownership, They had established agreements and permits. She approached the group, adopting her most professional demeanor. "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Elizabeth Martin, founder of the Maple Street Community Garden. May I ask what's happening here?" Craig Donovan turned, his surprise quickly masked by a practiced smile. "Ms. Martin, what a coincidence. We were just discussing the potential of this underutilized parcel." "Underutilized?" Elizabeth gestured to the thriving garden plots, the children's playground, the community gathering space. "This garden serves hundreds of families. It's a registered educational site for 3 local schools." Alan Peterson cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ms. Martin, while we appreciate the community's efforts here, this lot is technically still owned by the city and zoned for commercial development. After 10 years of the city supporting this project," Elizabeth challenged. "We have permits, agreements, temporary use permits," Craig interjected smoothly, "which the city has every right to reconsider when a better use presents itself." Elizabeth turned to Peterson. "And Metropolitan's proposal is a better use?" The city official looked uncomfortable. "Their mixed-use development would generate significant tax revenue and create jobs. Their proposal includes destroying this entire garden to build a parking structure." Elizabeth interrupted, having spotted the rolled blueprints under Craig's arm. "How does concrete over green space serve this community?" By now, more neighbors had gathered, murmuring in concern. Elizabeth spotted several families whose children used the playground daily, elderly residents who relied on the garden's fresh produce, the science teacher from the elementary school who brought classes for hands-on lessons. Craig sensed the growing tension and attempted damage control. "Our development will include green spaces. Decorative planters around a parking garage are not the same as a working community garden." Elizabeth countered. More neighbors were arriving, word having spread through the community text chain Elizabeth had helped establish years ago. Among them was Mr. Chan, the hardware store owner who had recently agreed to partner with Maple Heritage. "What happens to the children's summer program if you take this space?" Mr. Chun demanded. "Where will my grandchildren learn to grow food?" Craig's confident smile faltered as more residents joined the confrontation. Elizabeth stepped back, allowing the community to speak for itself. This wasn't about her versus Richard anymore. It was about the neighborhood fighting for its identity. Mrs. Abernathy arrived, using her cane but moving with purpose. At 78, she still commanded respect, especially from city officials who remembered her 30 years as a formidable high school principal. "Alan Peterson," she called, her voice carrying clearly. "Your mother and I taught together for 20 years. She helped plant those apple trees." She pointed to the small orchard at the garden's edge. "What would she say about this?" Peterson looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Abernathy, this is simply a preliminary assessment. It's an attempt to circumvent proper community input." Elizabeth interjected, her professional experience taking over. "Any change in use for this property would require public hearings, environmental impact studies, and a vote by the full city council." The confrontation continued for nearly an hour, with more residents arriving to defend the garden. Elizabeth stayed involved but was careful not to dominate. This was the community's fight, and their voices needed to be heard. Finally, Diane arrived with another attorney from her firm. After a brief consultation with Elizabeth, they approached Peterson directly. "My client, Maple Heritage LLC, is prepared to file an immediate injunction if there's any attempt to change this garden's status without due process," Diane stated firmly. "We've also taken the liberty of contacting several council members who've expressed concern about the lack of transparency in this assessment." Peterson checked his watch, clearly eager to escape the increasingly hostile situation. "As I said, this is merely a preliminary review. No decisions have been made. Then we look forward to participating in the official review process," Diane replied smoothly, "with full community involvement as required by city ordinance." As the city officials and metropolitan representatives retreated to their vehicles, Elizabeth felt a moment of victory. But she knew this was just the beginning. Metropolitan had shown their hand. They weren't content with just acquiring houses. They wanted to fundamentally reshape the neighborhood, erasing its character and community spaces. After the officials departed, the neighbors gathered around Elizabeth, questions and concerns tumbling out. Can they really take the garden? What about our summer programs? My family depends on the food we grow here. Elizabeth raised her hands for quiet. The garden isn't gone yet, she assured them, and Maple Heritage is committed to preserving it. But Metropolitan has the city in their pocket, Mr. Finch pointed. Out, we saw that today. They have influence, not control, Elizabeth corrected. And we have something more powerful: community solidarity and a better vision for the future. She outlined Maple Heritage's plan to establish a formal land trust for the garden, permanently protecting it from development. The announcement was met with enthusiastic support. As the impromptu meeting dispersed, Mrs. Abernathy lingered. They're getting desperate, she observed. Going after the garden shows they're feeling the pressure. Elizabeth nodded. Richard doesn't like losing, and Metropolitan has too much invested in this project to back down easily. What's our next move? Mrs. Abernathy asked. We accelerate everything, Elizabeth replied. Property acquisitions, community outreach, political allies. She glanced around the garden, at the children playing, the seniors tending their plants, the families gathering fresh vegetables for dinner. And we make sure everyone understands exactly what's at stake. Later that evening, Elizabeth sat in Meredith's office, updating her and Catherine on the day's events. Targeting the garden is a tactical error, Catherine observed. It makes them look like villains. Which we can use to our advantage, Meredith agreed. The community angle is powerful. David versus Goliath always makes good press. Elizabeth nodded, but her expression remained troubled. It's not just about winning the PR battle. Seeing those children today, the families who depend on that space, it reminded me why we're doing this. It's not just about beating Richard. No, Catherine agreed, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. It's about protecting something worth saving. Looking at the two powerful women who had become her unlikely allies, Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just business anymore. It wasn't even just personal. It was a fight for the soul of a community. Richard slammed his office door with enough force to rattle the framed architectural awards on his wall. 3 months into what should have been a straightforward neighborhood acquisition, the Maple Street project was turning into a nightmare. 17 properties, he growled, glaring at the map spread across his desk. 17 prime properties now controlled by Maple Heritage? How the hell did this happen? Craig Donovan paced by the window, his usual confidence replaced by barely concealed anxiety. They're moving faster than any development company I've ever seen. It's like they have unlimited capital and no bureaucratic constraints. Because they're not playing by the rules, Richard snapped. Elizabeth is behind this, I'm certain of it. But she can't possibly have these kinds of resources on her own. The property records don't show her name anywhere, Craig noted. Maple Heritage is officially owned by a network of LLCs that all trace back to Jameson Capital. Marcus Jameson, Richard muttered. Conservative investor, reputation for ethical development. Not someone who'd normally compete against Metropolitan. He drummed his fingers on the desk. Someone else is pulling the strings. Someone with money and a grudge, the intercom buzzed. Mr. Winthrop, Mayor Wilson is on line 1. Richard straightened his tie and took a deep breath, switching into charm mode before answering. Madame Mayor, thank you for returning my call. The conversation was brief and decidedly one-sided. Richard's expression darkened as he listened, occasionally attempting to interject, but clearly being overruled. When he finally hung up, his face was flushed with barely contained rage. The city council is postponing the vote on our zoning request, he informed Craig. Apparently, there are community concerns that need to be addressed before they can approve our development plan. Elizabeth, Craig said grimly. Not just Elizabeth, Richard corrected. She's got half the neighborhood mobilized. The council meeting was packed with Maple Street residents protesting our proposal. Seniors, families with children, small business owners, all with the same talking points about neighborhood character and community preservation. Craig collapsed into a chair. This is a disaster. We've already invested millions in property acquisitions and preliminary development work. Our investors are expecting returns. Don't remind me, Richard muttered, thinking of Catherine and Westlake Partners. His ex-wife had been unusually quiet lately, not responding to his updates or requests for additional funding. Her initial investment had been substantial, but with the unexpected competition from Maple Heritage, they needed more capital to secure the remaining properties quickly. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Cassandra entered, her expression unusually serious. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but there's something you need to see. She handed Richard a tablet displaying a business news website. It just went live. Richard read the headline aloud. Maple Heritage unveils comprehensive Neighborhood Preservation Plan for Historic Maple Street District. What is this? He scanned the article, his anger growing with each paragraph. Maple Heritage had released detailed plans for their alternative development vision, a mix of restored historic homes, sensitively designed new construction, affordable housing for seniors, expanded green spaces, and small business incubator spaces. The plan explicitly contrasted their approach with corporate developers seeking to erase neighborhood character for maximum profit. They're positioning themselves as the saviors of the neighborhood, Craig observed, and us as the villains. It gets worse, Cassandra added, taking back the tablet and scrolling down. They've already secured preliminary approval from the Historical Society and Environmental Commission, and they've got letters of support from 3 city council members. Richard slammed his fist on the desk. This is war. Elizabeth thinks she can outmaneuver me. She has no idea who she's dealing with. Actually, Cassandra said carefully, the press release doesn't mention Elizabeth Martin anywhere. The quotes are all from Tyler Oakes, their community relations director, and Meredith Chang, their executive VP. Meredith Chang? Richard frowned. Why is that name familiar? She worked with Elizabeth at Morgan Stanley, Cassandra replied. I did some research. They were close friends before Elizabeth scaled back her career. Richard's eyes narrowed. So Elizabeth recruited her old finance buddy. That explains some of the investment strategy, but not the capital. Meredith Chang doesn't have that kind of money. Maybe not, Craig interjected, but she has connections. Particularly at Jameson Capital, where she worked before joining Maple Heritage. The pieces were starting to fit together in Richard's mind, but something still didn't add up. The speed and aggression of Maple Heritage's moves suggested not just business competition, but personal motivation. Elizabeth was certainly motivated by the house, but this campaign went far beyond reclaiming one property. I need to know who's really bankrolling this operation, Richard decided. Expand the private investigator's scope. I want to know every investor, every connection, every potential weak point in their organization. That's going to be expensive, Craig warned, and we're already over budget on this project. Then find more funding, Richard snapped. Talk to the other investors. We're not losing this project because of a cash flow issue. Craig looked uncomfortable. That's another problem. Westlake Partners is holding back their next investment tranche. Catherine wants to see demonstrable progress before committing. Additional funds, Richard's temper flared. Catherine's playing hardball now. Perfect timing. She's a businesswoman, Craig reminded him. If the project looks shaky, the project is not shaky, Richard interrupted forcefully. We have the experience, the political connections, and the superior development plan. Maple Heritage is an annoyance, nothing more. Cassandra cleared her throat. There's one more thing you should know. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I've been reviewing the acquisition records more carefully. There's a pattern to Maple Heritage's purchases that seems ... targeted. What do you mean? Richard asked. They're specifically acquiring properties that block potential construction access points for your development. They're creating a strategic barrier, property by property. Richard stared at her, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. That level of calculated opposition wasn't amateur work. It wasn't even standard business competition. That's Elizabeth, he said quietly. She always was good at chess. Thinking. 5 moves ahead. Richard, Craig said carefully, maybe we should consider a different approach. The Chun hardware store just partnered with Maple Heritage. The community garden mobilized 300 residents against our proposal. The political winds are shifting. You're suggesting we give up? Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. Not give up. Pivot. Scale back the proposal. Incorporate more of the existing structures. Present a compromise that could... Absolutely not. Richard cut him off. We don't compromise. Metropolitan doesn't lose to amateurs playing developer. But no. Richard's tone was final. We double down. Accelerate offers on remaining properties. Call in every political favor we have. And find the weak point in Maple Heritage's armor. Craig hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. I'll make the calls. After Craig left, Cassandra lingered, studying Richard with an expression he couldn't quite read. What? He demanded. This isn't just business for you anymore, is it? She asked. It's about beating Elizabeth. Richard straightened a stack of papers on his desk, avoiding her gaze. Elizabeth made it personal when she interfered with my development. Or you made it personal When you took her house, Cassandra suggested quietly. His head snapped up. Whose side are you on? Yours, obviously, she replied, but her tone lacked conviction. I just think you might be letting your history with Elizabeth cloud your judgment. My judgment is perfectly clear, Richard insisted. And I'd appreciate your support, not your amateur psychoanalysis. Cassandra's expression hardened. Fine, I'll update the investor presentation with the new timeline. Anything else? Yes, get Catherine on the phone. I want to know why Westlake is suddenly developing. Cold feet. After Cassandra left, Richard turned to the window, staring out at the city skyline he'd helped shape over 20 years of development work. He'd never lost a major project, certainly not to an upstart company created specifically to oppose him. The fact that Elizabeth was behind it made the situation intolerable. She'd been the quiet, supportive wife for years, seemingly content with her neighborhood projects and scaled-back career. He'd never imagined she could mobilize this kind of opposition. He'd underestimated her. A mistake he wouldn't make again. His phone pinged with a text from Cassandra. Catherine's assistant says she's unavailable all week. Suggested you email your concerns. Richard frowned. Catherine was never unavailable for business matters. Something wasn't right, Dot. He picked up his desk phone and dialed Catherine's private number, the one she reserved for important contacts. It went straight to voicemail. Catherine, it's Richard. We need to talk about Westlake's commitment to the Maple Street project. Call me back immediately. As he hung up, a disturbing thought occurred to him. Catherine had been unusually interested in the details of this particular project from the beginning, asking for updates and specific property information that investors typically didn't concern themselves with. And now she was suddenly unavailable as the project faced its first serious challenge. No, he muttered to himself. She wouldn't. But even as he dismissed the thought, a cold certainty began forming in the pit of his stomach. If Catherine was somehow involved with Maple Heritage, Richard grabbed his keys and headed for the door. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start looking. The conference room at Jameson Capital hummed with an energy that felt like victory. Elizabeth stood before the neighborhood map, now dominated by blue pens representing Maple Heritage properties. In just 4 months, they had secured 32 parcels, over 80% of the available properties in the target area. The Hendersons. Signed yesterday, Tyler reported, adding another blue pin. That completes the eastern boundary. And the Wilson property? Elizabeth asked. Closing next week, Meredith confirmed. That will give us complete control of the access points from Main Street. Marcus Jameson studied the map with satisfaction. Metropolitan is effectively boxed in. They own 7 properties in a checkerboard pattern that makes cohesive development impossible. Elizabeth felt a complex mix of emotions, professional pride in their accomplishment, personal satisfaction at outmaneuvering Richard, but also a deeper sense of purpose and protecting the neighborhood she loved. What about my house? She asked, pointing to the red pen representing her former home. Any movement there? Diane, their legal counsel, shook her head. Still under contract with the buyer Metropolitan brought in, but with our properties surrounding it on all sides, their development plans are effectively stalled. Which brings us to our next decision, Catherine said, entering the room with her characteristic precision timing. Phase 2 of our strategy. Everyone turned toward the elegant investor who had become the project's most powerful advocate. Catherine set her briefcase on the table and removed several folders. Metropolitan is vulnerable, she continued. Their investors are getting nervous about the lack of progress. The city council is responding to community pressure against their high-density proposal, and Richard ... She allowed herself a small smile. Richard is making emotional decisions rather than strategic ones. He's desperate, Meredith agreed. His last 2 projects are underperforming, and he's personally guaranteed some of the Metropolitan loans. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. How do we know that? I have my sources, Catherine replied smoothly. The important thing is that he's now in a position where failure isn't an option, which makes this the perfect time to present our offer. Offer? Elizabeth echoed, confused. What offer? Catherine distributed folders to everyone at the table. Maple Heritage offers to buy Metropolitan's Maple Street properties at a 15% premium over their purchase price. They cut their losses. We consolidate our position, and the development proceeds under our vision. The room fell silent as everyone processed this bold proposal. They'll never accept, Tyler said finally. Richard's ego won't allow it. Perhaps, Catherine acknowledged. But making the offer publicly accomplishes several objectives. It demonstrates our financial strength. It positions us as reasonable and solution-oriented. And it forces Metropolitan to explain to their investors why they're rejecting a profitable exit from a failing project. Elizabeth studied Catherine with newfound respect. This wasn't just business strategy, it was psychological warfare. There's more, Catherine continued. I've been in discussions with Councilwoman Rivera about establishing a neighborhood conservation district for Maple Street. Once approved, it would place additional restrictions on demolition and new construction, restrictions that our development plan already accommodates, but that would make Metropolitan's high-density proposal impossible. That's brilliant, Elizabeth admitted. It's leveraging our advantages, Catherine corrected. We have community support, a preservation-minded development plan, and control of the majority of the neighborhood. Now we use those assets to maximum effect. The meeting continued with detailed discussions of timing, press strategy, and contingency plans. Elizabeth participated actively, but found herself increasingly distracted by thoughts of her former home, the one property in the neighborhood that still felt like a personal loss rather than a business calculation. After the meeting, Catherine held Elizabeth back as the others filed out. You're troubled by something, she observed. Elizabeth hesitated, then decided on honesty. All of this, the properties, the community support, the political alliances, it's an incredible achievement, but my house is still in Richard's control. Catherine studied her thoughtfully. The house was never our primary objective. The neighborhood protection was. I know, and I'm committed to that larger goal, but it's personal, Catherine finished for her. I understand better than you might think. Elizabeth looked at her questioningly. Did you know Richard and I had a country house in the Berkshires? Catherine asked. A beautiful old farmhouse I spent 3 years restoring. During our divorce, he leveraged some fine print in our prenuptial agreement to claim it as part of his business assets because I'd used it once for a corporate retreat. He didn't, Elizabeth said, though of course she believed it. He did. And, like you, I had signed papers without careful review. Catherine's expression hardened momentarily before returning to its usual composed state. I could have fought it in court, but the legal fees would have exceeded the property's value. So, I let it go. I didn't know, Elizabeth said softly. No reason you would. Richard certainly wouldn't have mentioned it. Catherine gathered her materials. My point is that I understand the personal stake, but I also know that sometimes victory looks different than we initially imagine. As Catherine departed, Elizabeth remained in the conference room, studying the map with its constellation of blue and red pins. They had accomplished so much more than she'd initially envisioned, not just battling Richard for her house, but protecting an entire community from predatory development. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Abernathy. Special delivery at my house. Come see. Intrigued, Elizabeth drove to the corner Victorian. Mrs. Abernathy greeted her at the door with a triumphant smile and led her to the dining room table, where a large cardboard box sat open. Look, the older woman said proudly, removing a stack of papers from the box. Neighborhood archives. Birth certificates, property deeds, photographs, newspaper clippings, all the way back to 1910 when these houses were built. Elizabeth leafed through the yellowed documents with growing excitement. Where did these come from? The Historical Society had them in storage. When they heard about our conservation district proposal, they offered to help document the neighborhood's historical significance. Mrs. Abernathy pointed to a faded photograph of Elizabeth's house, circa 1915. Look, your grandmother's house in its original condition. Elizabeth studied the image, noting details that matched her own renovations, the distinctive porch columns, the stained glass window pattern she'd carefully restored. These are incredible, she said. With this documentation, the conservation district application will be even stronger. Exactly what I thought, Mrs. Abernathy agreed. And there's something else. She handed Elizabeth a fragile newspaper clipping. From 1923, look at the name of the original neighborhood developer. Elizabeth squinted at the faded print. Martin Developments. As in, your family, Mrs. Abernathy confirmed. I checked the genealogy records. James Martin was your grandmother's great-uncle. He built the entire eastern section of the neighborhood, including your house. It stayed in the family until your grandmother inherited it. Elizabeth sat down, stunned by this connection. I had no idea. Your grandmother never mentioned it. She died when I was in college. I barely knew her. Elizabeth touched the clipping. Gently, my house wasn't just a random inheritance. It was my family's legacy in this neighborhood. Which makes Richard's actions even more egregious, Mrs. Abernathy observed, and our fight even more meaningful. Later that evening, Elizabeth brought the historical documents to Meredith's office, where they were preparing the final details of their offer to Metropolitan. This changes our narrative, Meredith realized immediately. The Martin family hoped. Built this neighborhood a century ago. Now Elizabeth Martin is fighting to preserve it against corporate developers. It's perfect. It's true, Elizabeth corrected her. And it makes this even more important than I realized. As they worked late into the night, finalizing their strategy, Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about reclaiming what Richard had taken from her. It was about honoring a family legacy she hadn't even known existed. Trap was set. Metropolitan was surrounded, their options diminishing daily. Richard's signature achievement was crumbling before his eyes, and Elizabeth, after months of working quietly behind the scenes, was ready to step into the light and claim her place in the neighborhood's past and its future. The Maple Street Community Center buzzed with anticipation. Residents filled every seat, lined the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. At the front of the room, a podium stood flanked by large presentation boards covered with neighborhood plans. Elizabeth sat in the back row, watching as neighbors greeted each other, examined the displays, and speculated about the meeting's purpose. The official announcement had been deliberately vague. Important update on Maple Street. Development plans all residents encouraged to attend. Tyler moved through the crowd, answering questions and directing people to information packets. Meredith conferred with Marcus and Catherine near the podium. Everything was in place for the big reveal. Nervous? Mrs. Abernathy asked, settling into the chair beside Elizabeth. Terrified, Elizabeth admitted. After months of working behind the scenes, going public FEELS exposing. About time, if you ask me, Mrs. Abernathy replied. You've done more for this neighborhood than anyone has in decades. You should be recognized for it. Before Elizabeth could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression thunderous. Craig Donovan and 2 other Metropolitan executives followed close behind, along with a woman Elizabeth recognized as their public relations director. I wasn't sure he'd come, Elizabeth murmured. Of course he came, Mrs. Abernathy said. He couldn't resist. Richard always did need to control every situation. Tyler spotted Richard and approached with professional courtesy, offering information, packets, and directing the Metropolitan group to available seats. Richard ignored the materials, but took a position against the wall where he could observe the entire room. His gaze swept across the crowd until it locked on Elizabeth. She met his eyes steadily, refusing to look away first. After a long moment, his attention shifted to Catherine, who acknowledged him with the barest nod before turning back to her conversation at precisely 7 p.m. Meredith stepped to the podium. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this important community meeting. My name is Meredith Chang, Executive Vice President of Maple Heritage LLC. For the past 5 months, our company has been working to develop a comprehensive plan for the future of Maple Street, a plan that preserves what makes this neighborhood special while allowing for thoughtful growth and improvement. She gestured to the presentation boards showing architectural renderings, street plans, and green spaces. Tonight, we're excited to share our complete vision with you. But first, I'd like to introduce the person who inspired this project and has guided its development from the beginning. Elizabeth took a deep breath and stood, making her way to the podium amid curious murmurs from the crowd. She could feel Richard's eyes boring into her back, but kept her focus forward. Many of you know me as Elizabeth Martin, she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I lived on Maple Street for 15 years, in the Victorian on Oak Lane that my grandmother left to me. What many of you don't know is that my connection to this neighborhood goes back much further. She revealed the historical documents Mrs. Abernathy had discovered, explaining her family's role in the neighborhood's original development. The crowd responded with appreciative murmurs and nods. When circumstances forced me to leave my home, Elizabeth continued carefully, I could have simply moved on. But I realized that what was happening to me, the loss of a beloved home with deep personal significance, was about to happen to this entire community. She outlined Metropolitan's plans for wholesale redevelopment, contrasting them with Maple Heritage's preservation-focused approach. She explained how they had systematically acquired properties to prevent the neighborhood's destruction, working with residents to ensure they could remain in their homes while also benefiting financially. Our proposal includes restoration of historic homes, sensitive new construction that matches neighborhood tour, permanently protected green spaces including the community garden, and a small business district centered around locally owned shops like Chun's Hardware. Elizabeth explained, pointing to the detailed plans. The presentation continued for 20 minutes, with Elizabeth detailing specific aspects of their development vision. Throughout, she was careful to focus on the community benefits rather than her personal battle with Richard. Finally, she concluded, "I'm pleased to announce that Maple Heritage has secured designation of this area as a historic conservation district, ensuring that the neighborhood's character will be protected for generations to come." This announcement drew spontaneous applause from many residents. From his position against the wall, Richard's face darkened further. "We've also submitted a formal offer to Metropolitan Development to purchase their Maple Street properties at a premium," Elizabeth added. "This would allow for a unified development approach that benefits the entire community." At this, Richard pushed himself away from the wall and strode toward the podium, his controlled facade finally cracking. "This is absurd," he interrupted loudly. "Elizabeth has no development experience. Maple Heritage is a shell company created solely to interfere with a legitimate business enterprise. This entire project is nothing but a personal vendetta." The room fell silent, all eyes moving between Richard and Elizabeth. "This isn't personal, Richard," Elizabeth replied calmly, though her heart hammered in her chest. "It's about protecting a historic neighborhood from inappropriate development." "Bullshit," Richard snapped, his professional polish evaporating. "You created this entire operation because you're bitter about our divorce." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elizabeth held her ground, refusing to be baited into an emotional response. "Maple Heritage exists because residents deserve a better option than having their community destroyed," she said evenly. "Our plan preserves homes, creates green spaces, and keeps the neighborhood affordable for current residents. If you'd like to discuss the merits of the competing proposals, I'm happy to do that." Richard ignored the olive branch. "You don't have the expertise or the capital for a project of this scale. This is a fantasy created to salve your wounded pride." Catherine stepped forward then, her elegant presence commanding immediate attention. "Actually, Richard, Maple Heritage has both the expertise and the capital. As their primary investor, I can assure you of that." Richard froze, staring at his first wife in stunned disbelief. You're behind this?" "I recognized a superior investment opportunity," Catherine replied coolly, "both financially and ethically." The revelation sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Richard looked from Catherine to Elizabeth and back again, his expression shifting from shock to fury. "So this was your plan all along, the two of you conspiring against me?" "There was no conspiracy," Elizabeth corrected him. "Catherine made a business decision based on the merits of our proposal. Just as you made a business decision when you transferred my house into your name without my informed consent." This direct reference to Richard's actions caused several residents to gasp. Mrs. Abernathy stood up from her seat. "Is that true, Richard?" she demanded. "You took Elizabeth's inherited home through deception?" Richard glared at the elderly woman. "This is a private matter that has no bearing on the development project." "On the contrary," Marcus Jameson interjected, joining the conversation. "It speaks directly to the ethics of the competing developers. Character matters in business partnerships." The community meeting had transformed into a public reckoning. Residents began asking pointed questions about Metropolitan's plans, their demolition timeline, the expected property tax increases, and the fate of current residents who couldn't afford luxury condos. Richard attempted to regain control, falling back on his practiced corporate responses, but the mood of the room had shifted decisively against him. His smooth assurances about neighborhood improvement rang hollow against Elizabeth's detailed preservation plan. As the meeting concluded, residents clustered around the Maple Heritage displays, engaging enthusiastically with Elizabeth and her team. Richard stood alone by the door, watching the scene with barely concealed rage. Elizabeth approached him, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "The offer to buy your property stands," she said quietly. "It's a fair price that would allow you to exit the project without losses." Richard's laugh was bitter, You think this is over? One community meeting doesn't change anything. Metropolitan doesn't surrender. This isn't about surrender, Elizabeth replied. It's about recognizing reality. You can't develop a neighborhood where you control only 7 scattered properties. Watch. Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. This war is just beginning, Elizabeth. As he stormed out, Cassandra lingered behind, giving Elizabeth a long, appraising look before following her boss. Catherine joined Elizabeth, watching Richard's retreat with cool detachment. He'll fight, she observed. Yes, Elizabeth agreed. But for the first time, I think he knows he might lose. Around them, the community buzzed with excitement about the plans. Residents forming impromptu discussion groups to explore aspects of the proposal. Mrs. Abernathy beamed with pride as she explained the historical significance of various buildings to younger neighbors. This was what victory looked like. Elizabeth realized not just defeating Richard, but uniting a community around a shared vision for its future. And for the first time since she'd watched Richard hammer that for sale sign into her lawn, Elizabeth felt not just vindicated, but genuinely at peace. Elizabeth stood on the steps of City Hall, camera flashes capturing the moment as Mayor Wilson handed her this designation document. It is my pleasure to officially recognize the Maple Street Historic Conservation District, the mayor announced to the assembled crowd. This designation ensures that one of our city's most distinctive neighborhoods will be preserved for future generations while allowing for appropriate development and renewal. Applause rippled through the gathering neighborhood residents, preservationists, local business owners, and media representatives. Elizabeth accepted the document with a sense of accomplishment that transcended her personal victory over Richard. On behalf of Maple Heritage and the Maple Street community, thank you, she said into the microphones. This designation represents countless hours of work by residents, dedicated to preserving their neighborhood's character while ensuring it remains vibrant and accessible for years to come. The press conference continued with questions about specific preservation guidelines, development timelines, and the economic impact of the designation. Elizabeth fielded them confidently, her months of intensive work on the project evident in her detailed knowledge of every aspect. A reporter from the Business Journal raised his hand. Ms. Martin, how do you respond to Metropolitan Development's claim that this designation was fast-tracked inappropriately due to personal connections? Elizabeth had anticipated this question. The application followed all standard procedures and met every criterion for historic designation. The unanimous approval by the city's Historic Preservation Commission and the city councils, 11-2 vote, speak to the merits of the application, not any supposed personal influence. After the press conference, Elizabeth joined Meredith, Catherine, and Marcus at a small celebration in Mrs. Abernathy's garden. Neighborhood residents filtered in and out, congratulating them and sharing stories of their relief at knowing their community was now protected. To the Maple Street Historic Conservation District, Marcus toasted, raising his glass. And to Elizabeth, who turned a personal setback into a community triumph. As glasses clinked, Elizabeth felt a wave of emotion. The journey from that devastating moment in her car, watching Richard hammer and the for sale sign, to the celebration seemed almost surreal. What's next? Mrs. Abernathy asked, settling into a garden chair beside Elizabeth. The Community Land Trust, Elizabeth replied. That's our focus for the next phase. The Maple Street Community Land Trust had been Catherine's suggestion, a legal structure that would permanently protect affordable housing in the neighborhood by removing the land beneath key properties from the speculative market. Residents would own their homes but lease the land from the trust at nominal rates, keeping housing costs stable even as property values increased in surrounding areas. We've already secured commitments from 15 homeowners, Meredith added, including Mrs. Abernathy and the Ramirez family. And the funding is in place, Catherine confirmed. The trust will be fully operational within 90 days. Elizabeth smiled at the business-like discussion. What had begun as her personal fight against Richard had evolved into something far more significant, a comprehensive approach to neighborhood preservation that was drawing attention from urban planners nationwide. The conversation shifted to the ongoing negotiations with Metropolitan. Richard had initially rejected their offer to purchase his properties, but his position was weakening daily. 2 of Metropolitan's investment partners had withdrawn their funding after the Conservation District designation made their high-density development plan impossible. Richard was facing not just defeat, but potentially significant financial losses. His options are limited, Marcus observed. He can sell to us at a modest profit, hold properties that no longer fit his development model, or try to devise a new plan that complies with the conservation guidelines. He's too proud to sell to us directly, Catherine predicted. But he may seek a third-party buyer who could then deal with Maple Heritage. Elizabeth nodded, having come to the same conclusion. Richard would look for any solution that allowed him to save face while extracting himself from the failing project. The following morning, Elizabeth met with the city planning department to discuss the next steps for the neighborhood. The conservation designation provided protection, but now came the more complex work of balancing preservation with necessary improvements. The infrastructure needs updating, Elizabeth acknowledged, reviewing the neighborhood assessment. Some of these water and sewer lines are original to the 1910 development. That's our biggest concern, the planning director agreed. Historic preservation is important, but so is functional infrastructure. They spent 2 hours developing a phased approach that would update essential systems while minimizing disruption to the neighborhood's character. Elizabeth's attention to these practical details had earned her respect from city officials, who had initially viewed her as simply an angry ex-wife with a grudge. As she left City Hall, Elizabeth spotted a familiar figure waiting by her car. Cassandra, Richard's girlfriend and executive assistant. Ms. Bowell, Elizabeth acknowledged cautiously. This is unexpected. Cassandra seemed uncharacteristically nervous. I was hoping we could talk, not here somewhere private. Intrigued, Elizabeth suggested a small cafe several blocks away. They walked in silence, an odd pair, Richard's ex-wife and his current girlfriend, both elegant women with briefcases and professional demeanors. Once seated in a quiet corner with coffee, Cassandra got straight to the point. Richard is planning something desperate, she said without preamble. The Maple Street failure has put him in a difficult position financially. His investors are demanding explanations, and he's not handling it well. Elizabeth studied the younger woman carefully. Why are you telling me this? Cassandra stirred her coffee, avoiding eye contact. Because I've seen how he operates when he feels cornered, the tactics he employs. She looked up finally. And because I've learned enough about you to respect what you're trying to accomplish. You're worried he'll do something unethical to salvage the project, Elizabeth guessed. I'm certain of it, Cassandra confirmed. He's been meeting with his attorneys about finding technical flaws in the Conservation District application. He's researching the personal backgrounds of city council members who voted for the designation, looking for leverage. Elizabeth frowned. That sounds like potential blackmail. I'm not saying he would go that far, Cassandra hedged, though her expression suggested otherwise. But he's desperate. The Maple Street project isn't just another development to him anymore. It's personal. It was always personal, Elizabeth pointed out, from the moment he took my house. Cassandra nodded slowly. I've come to realize that, which is why I thought you should be prepared. She hesitated, then added, and why I've decided to leave Metropolitan. And Richard, Elizabeth's eyebrows rose in surprise. Because of this project? Because I've seen a side of him I can't respect. Cassandra replied simply. The way he talks about you, about the neighborhood residents, about anyone who opposes him. It's revealed character traits I don't want in my life. They finished their coffee in a strange but companionable silence, two women united by their separate experiences with the same man. As they parted outside, Cassandra handed Elizabeth a thumb drive. Financial projections, investor communications, internal strategy documents. Nothing confidential enough to create legal issues for me, but information that might help you anticipate his next moves. Elizabeth stared at the small device. Why? Let's just say I believe in karma, Cassandra replied with a faint smile, and in protecting communities that matter to people. Back at the Maple Heritage office, Elizabeth shared Cassandra's warning with her team. Catherine immediately arranged for additional legal support to review the conservation district application for any potential vulnerabilities. Meredith accelerated the community land trust formation to solidify their position. We should also prepare for media management, Marcus advised. If Richard gets desperate enough to try character assassination, we need to be ready to respond effectively. Elizabeth nodded, grateful for their swift support, but troubled by the escalation. What had begun as a business conflict was veering into potentially uglier territory. That evening, she visited the community garden, seeking perspective in the peaceful space she'd helped create years ago. Children played on the small playground, while elderly residents tended their vegetable plots. Young couples strolled along the flower-lined paths. This was what they were protecting, not just buildings, but a living community. Mr. Chan approached, offering her a fresh tomato from his garden plot. "First harvest of the season," he said proudly. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth replied, accepting the gift. "Not as beautiful as what you have accomplished," the hardware store owner said. "My grandchildren will grow up in a neighborhood that remembers its history. My business will remain where my father established it. These things have value beyond money." Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of purpose in his simple words. Whatever Richard might attempt next, the community they had built around this project was stronger than his. Desperation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Meredith. Breaking news. Richard stepped down as CEO of Metropolitan Development. Interim leadership announced. "Call me." Elizabeth stared at the message in disbelief. Richard stepping down from the company he built over 20 years? It seemed impossible. As she hurried to her car, another text arrived. This one from an unknown number. "You win. But this isn't over." Our Elizabeth wasn't sure if it was a concession, a threat, or both. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that the community they had fought so hard to protect might truly be secure. The business section of the Sunday paper featured a headline Elizabeth had never expected to see: "Metropolitan Development in Turmoil. Winterbow projects under review." The accompanying photo showed Richard leaving the company headquarters, expression grim, refusing to comment to assembled reporters. According to the article, Richard's departure had been described as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities. But industry insiders suggested he had been forced out by the board after the Maple Street debacle and other underperforming projects had shaken investor confidence. Elizabeth set the paper aside, unsure how to feel. Professional satisfaction, certainly, they had outmaneuvered a powerful opponent. But there was no joy in seeing someone's career implode, even Richard's. Her phone rang. "Catherine." "I assume you've seen the news," her unlikely ally said without preamble. "Just reading it now," Elizabeth confirmed. "Was this your doing?" "Not directly," Catherine replied, though Westlake's withdrawal of support certainly contributed. Richard has been making increasingly erratic decisions. The Maple Street failure was simply the final straw for his board. What happens to Metropolitan's properties in the neighborhood now? "That's why I'm calling," Catherine said. "Their interim CEO reached out this morning. They're interested in discussing terms for selling their Maple Street holdings." Elizabeth sat up straighter. "All of them?" "Including my house. All 7 properties," Catherine confirmed. "They want a clean exit from the project." "When can we meet?" "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at my office." Catherine paused. "Elizabeth, you should prepare yourself. We'll likely get these properties, but perhaps not on the terms you might hope for." After hanging up, Elizabeth stared out her apartment window, thoughts churning. Metropolitan's willingness to sell was a victory for the neighborhood plan, but Catherine's warning suggested complications regarding her former home. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived at Catherine's downtown office to find Meredith, Marcus, and Diane already assembled in the conference room. Metropolitan was represented by their interim CEO Patricia Lawson, CFO Mark Jenkins, and legal counsel. The negotiations proceeded with brisk efficiency. Metropolitan agreed to sell 6 of their properties at the price. Maple Heritage had originally offered a 15% premium over Metropolitan's purchase cost. The 7th property, Elizabeth's former house, was more complicated. "We have a binding sales contract with an external buyer," Patricia explained. The sale was already in process when the Conservation District was approved. "The buyer is aware of the new development restrictions?" Marcus asked. "Fully informed," Patricia confirmed. "They're proceeding with the purchase despite the limitations and modifications." Elizabeth felt a pang of disappointment. She had hoped that with Metropolitan retreating, there might be an opportunity to reclaim her house. But if another buyer was already under contract, who is the buyer? She asked directly. Patricia exchanged glances with her legal counsel. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information." "Then we have a problem," Catherine interjected smoothly. "Maple Heritage's goal is unified development of the neighborhood. An unknown buyer with unknown intentions for a property central to our planning creates significant complications." What followed was 2 hours of intense negotiation. Metropolitan refused to cancel their external sale, but eventually agreed to several concessions. The buyer would be required to adhere to additional architectural guidelines beyond the Conservation District requirements. and Maple Heritage would have right of first refusal if the property was ever resold by noon. They had a framework agreement for Metropolitan's complete withdrawal from the Maple Street project. As the Metropolitan team gathered their materials to leave, Patricia paused beside Elizabeth. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I was against how the company acquired your house. Some of us tried to advise Richard against such aggressive tactics." Elizabeth nodded, unsure how to respond to this unexpected acknowledgement. After Metropolitan's representatives departed, Catherine's assistant brought lunch while they discussed next steps. "Overall, this is an excellent outcome," Marcus concluded. "We now control or influence all but one property in the target area, and we've secured adequate protections regarding that remaining property," Meredith added. "Whoever this mystery buyer is, they'll have to work within our neighborhood vision." Elizabeth nodded, trying to focus on the bigger picture rather than her lingering disappointment about her house. Later that afternoon, as she drove to meet Tyler at the community center, Elizabeth passed by her former home. A moving truck was parked in the driveway, workers carrying furniture inside rather than out. The mysterious buyer was apparently taking possession immediately. She slowed, unable to resist the pull of curiosity and nostalgia. The house looked the same, the garden she'd planted still blooming, the porch swing still hanging where she'd installed it. Only the ownership had changed. As she watched, a tall man emerged from the house, directing the movers with the storage cabinet. Elizabeth froze, recognizing him immediately despite the distance, not the mysterious buyer, but Richard himself. Without conscious thought, she pulled over and got out of her car. Richard spotted her as she approached, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness. "Elizabeth," he acknowledged stiffly. "This is unexpected. You're the buyer?" She asked incredulously. "After everything that's happened, you're keeping the house?" Richard's laugh held no humor. "Ironic, isn't it? I lose my company, my investors, my girlfriend, but I keep the house that started all." Elizabeth studied him more carefully. He looked different, thinner, less polished, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Why?" she asked finally. "You never even liked this house. You complained about the creaky floors and old plumbing. Why fight to keep it?" Richard gestured for the movers to continue without him and led Elizabeth to the front porch, her porch, with the swing she'd hung and the planters she'd built. "I didn't appreciate it then," he admitted, surprising her with his candor. "But after living in a sterile downtown condo for months, I realized what you created here had value I didn't recognize." Elizabeth wasn't sure what to say. This seemed so unlike the Richard she knew, the man who valued sleek modernity and efficient luxury over character and history. "Besides," he continued, with a shadow of his old smirk, "it's the only property I still control in the area. Consider it my consolation prize." Ah, there was the Richard she recognized, still framing everything as winning or losing, even in defeat. "Congratulations, then," she said dryly. "Though you should know the Conservation District guidelines are quite strict about exterior modifications, so I've been told, repeatedly." Richard's expression turned serious. "Your community trust concept is clever. I underestimated you, Elizabeth. I've been doing that for years, apparently." The admission, however grudging, caught her off guard. Before she could respond, his phone rang. He checked the display and grimaced. "My lawyer, again. Apparently, when you're forced out of your own company, there's endless paperwork." He pocketed the phone without answering. "I won't keep you. I'm sure you have a neighborhood to save." As Elizabeth turned to leave, a thought occurred to her. The Conservation District application included historical documentation for each property. "Your house," she caught herself. "This house was built by my great-great-uncle. It's been in my family since 1915. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "I didn't know that." "Neither did I until recently," she smiled faintly. "Funny how things circle back." Walking to her car, Elizabeth felt a strange mix of emotions: closure regarding the house, satisfaction about the neighborhood plan, and an unexpected sense of pity for Richard. He'd lost nearly everything in his desperate attempt to win at all costs. Her phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Contract signed. Metropolitan officially out of Maple Street. We won." Elizabeth glanced back at her former home, where Richard stood alone on the porch, surveying a neighborhood that had rejected his vision entirely. They had indeed won the war for Maple Street. But standing there in his designer clothes, surrounded by moving boxes in a house too large for one person, Richard looked less like a defeated opponent and more like a cautionary tale of pride and isolation. She drove away without looking back, heading toward the community center where neighbors were gathering to discuss the next phase of their shared vision. The past was settled. The future was waiting. 6 months later, Elizabeth pulled into the driveway of 1423 Maple Street, not her former house, but a charming craftsman bungalow 3 doors down that had unexpectedly come on the market when the elderly owners decided to move to Arizona. She gathered grocery bags from her trunk and navigated the stone path to her front door, stopping to admire the autumn chrysanthemums blooming in her newly planted garden. The house was smaller than her previous Victorian, but it suited her perfectly, enough space for comfort without excess. With original woodwork and built-in bookshelves she'd immediately fallen in love with. "Need a hand?" called Mrs. Abernethy from next door, where she was collecting her mail. "I've got it, thanks," Elizabeth replied with a smile. "Are you coming to the garden dedication this afternoon?" "Wouldn't miss it," the older woman assured her. "Tyler's picking me up at 3. Elizabeth waved goodbye and continued inside. The house was still a work in progress. Paint swatches decorated one wall as she debated color schemes, and some rooms remained sparsely furnished, but it already felt more like home than her downtown apartment ever had. After putting away groceries, she changed into business casual attire for the afternoon ceremony. The community garden's official dedication as a permanent green space was the culmination of months of legal work establishing the Maple Street Community Land Trust. She arrived early to help with final preparations. The garden had been transformed with new pathways, improved irrigation, and an expanded children's area. A small pavilion had been constructed for community gatherings, its design echoing the architectural elements of the surrounding historic homes. "Everything looks perfect," Meredith commented, joining Elizabeth by the refreshment table. "Hard to believe how much has changed in just a year." Elizabeth nodded, taking in the scene. Residents were arriving, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of a tight-knit community. Children raced to the playground while their parents arranged potluck dishes on long tables. "The neighborhood feels more connected than ever," she observed. "That's the real victory." The dedication ceremony began at 4 o'clock. As chair of the Community Land Trust Board, Elizabeth welcomed everyone and explained how the trust would protect key neighborhood properties, including the garden, from future development pressure. By separating land ownership from building ownership, she explained, we ensure that housing remains affordable even as property values increase. Homeowners lease the land from the trust at nominal rates, while the trust maintains permanent ownership of the land itself. Mayor Wilson spoke next, praising the innovative approach to neighborhood preservation. The Maple Street model is already inspiring similar efforts in 3 other historic districts, she noted. This community has shown what's possible when residents work together with vision and determination. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a small bronze plaque recognizing the garden's protected status. Afterward, the event transitioned into a neighborhood celebration, with music, food, and children playing tag between garden plots. Elizabeth mingled, accepting congratulations but also deflecting credit to the many community members who had contributed to the effort. This project had never been about her alone, and she was determined that its success be shared widely. As the afternoon light began to fade, she found herself standing at the garden's edge, watching fireflies begin to appear above the vegetable plots. Catherine joined her, elegant as always in a cream linen suit. "Quite the transformation," Catherine observed, surveying the scene. "Both the neighborhood and you," Elizabeth smiled. "I'm still getting used to being a community organizer, rather than a financial advisor." After the Maple Street project's success, Elizabeth had been offered several positions with urban planning and community development organizations. She'd ultimately accepted a role with a nonprofit focused on equitable neighborhood preservation, allowing her to apply the lessons from Maple Street to other communities facing development pressure. "You found your calling," Catherine said. "It suits you better than corporate finance ever did." Speaking of transformations, Elizabeth replied, "I heard Westlake Partners is focusing more on community-centered development projects now." Catherine's smile was enigmatic. "Let's just say our investment criteria have evolved." The Maple Street success demonstrated that ethical development can also be profitable development. As dusk deepened, lanterns illuminated the garden paths. Families gathered, blankets for stargazing, while others began reluctantly heading home. Elizabeth helped with cleanup, chatting easily with neighbors who had become friends through their shared struggle. Walking home later, She passed her former house, Richard's house now. Lights glowed in the windows, and the porch swing moved gently in the evening breeze. Richard's car wasn't in the driveway. He traveled frequently now, consulting on development projects in other cities. They had reached an unexpected détente in recent months. Richard had joined the neighborhood association, initially with obvious reluctance, but gradually becoming more engaged. He'd even volunteered his architectural expertise when the community center needed renovation plans. People could change, Elizabeth had discovered. Not dramatically, not overnight, but incrementally. When circumstances forced them to see the world differently. At home, Elizabeth settled on her porch with a glass of wine, reviewing notes for a presentation she was giving next week at an urban planning conference. The Maple Street model, community-led development and historic neighborhoods, had drawn significant interest from planners and community advocates. Nationwide. Her phone buzzed with a text from Meredith. Amazing day. You should be proud. Dinner tomorrow to celebrate? Elizabeth smiled and replied affirmatively. She was proud not just of what they'd accomplished, but of who she'd become through the process. The woman who had sat crying in her car as Richard hammered in a for sale sign seemed like a different person, now someone less confident, less aware of her own strength. The initial motivation had been anger and a desire for justice, but somewhere along the way, it had transformed into something more meaningful, a passion for preserving communities and empowering residents to shape their own neighborhoods. The porch light from Richard's house, her old house, suddenly went dark. Through the trees, she could see him moving inside, a solitary figure in rooms built for a family. She felt an unexpected moment of gratitude. His betrayal, painful as it had been, had ultimately led her here, to this porch, this community, this purposeful work. She raised her glass in a silent toast to unexpected journeys and new beginnings, then returned to her conference notes. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more plans, more work to secure the neighborhood's future. And for the first time in years, Elizabeth Martin was exactly where she wanted to be. 1 year to the day after the Maple Street Historic Conservation District was officially designated, Elizabeth stood in the community garden, watching children plant saplings along the newly expanded perimeter. The spring air carried the scent of fresh earth and promise, a fitting atmosphere for the neighborhood's tree planting ceremony. Careful with those roots, she instructed a small group of elementary schoolers. The tree needs them to drink water. Like straws, asked a freckled girl in overalls. Exactly like straws, Elizabeth confirmed, smiling as the child gently patted soil around a young oak's base. The garden had flourished under the protection of the community land trust. What had begun as a neighborhood victory garden had evolved into an educational center where local schools brought students for hands-on science lessons. Seniors taught traditional gardening techniques to younger generations, and families gathered for seasonal celebrations. Quite the operation you've got here, came a familiar voice behind her. Elizabeth turned to find Richard standing at the garden entrance, more casually dressed than she was accustomed to seeing him, khakis and a button-down rather than his usual tailored suit. In the years since Metropolitan's withdrawal from the neighborhood, they had established a cordial, if somewhat distant, relationship as neighbors. Just doing my part, she replied. Are you here for the ceremony? Actually, I have some paperwork for you. He gestured to a manila envelope tucked under his arm, thought it better to deliver in person. Curious, Elizabeth excused herself from the children and led Richard to a bench beneath a flowering crabapple tree. The document he handed her was thick with legal language, but the title page was clear enough. Property Transfer Agreement minus 1423 Maple Street. She looked up in confusion. I don't understand. Richard's expression was uncharacteristically hesitant. I'm relocating to Boston. Development consulting firm made an offer I couldn't refuse, and the house is yours if you want it. He indicated the document, not a gift. I'm not that reformed. But a fair market sale, directly to you, no competition. Elizabeth leafed through the paperwork, stunned. Why now? Richard was quiet for a moment, watching the children plant trees across the garden. Let's just say living in that house has been educational. I understand now why you fought so hard. For it was perhaps the closest thing to an apology she would ever receive from him. Elizabeth studied his profile, noting the subtle changes a year had brought less arrogance in his posture. Fewer stress lines around his eyes. Not a complete transformation, but a shift. I've moved on, Richard, she said finally. I have a new home here. A life I've built that I'm proud of. I know. He didn't seem surprised by her response. But I thought you should have the option. For what it's worth, I shouldn't have taken it from you in the first place. The admission hung between them, unexpected and weighty. What will you do with it if I decline? She asked. Deed it to the Community Land Trust, he replied, surprising. Her again. Make it part of your affordable housing program? Seems fitting somehow. Before Elizabeth could respond, Mrs. Abernathy approached, her cane tapping a cheerful rhythm on the garden path. Richard Winthrop, I didn't expect to see you at our tree planting, she said, her tone more curious than hostile. Just dropping. Off some paperwork, he explained, standing to offer her his seat. I'll be out of your way shortly. Mrs. Abernathy waved away the offered seat. Actually, we could use another pair of hands. The fifth graders are struggling with that maple sapling. Near the fence. Richard glanced at Elizabeth, clearly unsure if the invitation was genuine. Go ahead, she encouraged him. Consider it your contribution to the neighborhood you nearly demolished. He accepted the gentle jibe with a rueful smile and followed Mrs. Abernathy to the struggling young tree. Elizabeth watched as the unlikely pair instructed the children on proper planting techniques. Richard's expensive loafers soon covered in garden soil. The ceremony began an hour later, with Mayor Wilson returning to officially dedicate the expanded garden. As chair of the Community Land Trust, Elizabeth gave a brief speech about the neighborhood's journey. 1 year ago, we celebrated protecting this garden from development, she reminded the gathered community. Today, we're not just maintaining what we saved, we're growing it, making it stronger and more accessible for everyone. She outlined the trust's achievements over the past year, 10 properties transferred into the land trust model, ensuring permanent affordability, a small business incubator established in formerly vacant storefronts, the community center's renovation, and partnerships with local schools for educational programs. But perhaps our greatest accomplishment, she continued, has been proving that neighborhoods can grow and evolve without losing their essential character. That development doesn't have to mean destruction. That change can honor the past while creating a better future. As she spoke, Elizabeth noticed Richard at the edge of the crowd, listening intently. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. After the ceremony, as residents mingled over lemonade and cookies, Catherine arrived with Marcus, both having just flown in from New York for the occasion. The garden looks magnificent, Catherine approved, surveying the newly planted trees. And the business incubator is exceeding financial projections. This model has real potential for scaling. Always the investor, Elizabeth teased. Guilty as charged, Catherine admitted. Though I've developed an unexpected appreciation for social returns alongside financial ones. Marcus joined their conversation, updating Elizabeth on similar projects. Jameson Capital is now funding in other cities. Your Maple Street model is becoming a template. 3 neighborhoods in Chicago and 2 in Philadelphia are implementing variations of your community land trust approach. As they talked, Elizabeth noticed Richard preparing to leave. He nodded to her from across the garden, a gesture of farewell. She excused herself from Catherine and Marcus to catch him before he departed. About the house, she said when she reached him. The offer stands, he replied. No pressure, no deadline. The paperwork includes both options purchased by you or donation to the trust, your choice. Elizabeth considered the man who had once been her husband, the adversary who had taken her home, the neighbor who was now offering it back. People were complex, she had learned, even Richard. The trust option feels right, she decided. My grandmother would have liked knowing her home was helping keep the neighborhood affordable for families. Richard nodded, seemingly unsurprised. I'll have my lawyer modify the paperwork to reflect the donation. Should be finalized before I leave for Boston next month. Thank you, Elizabeth said simply. Don't thank me too quickly, Richard warned, a hint of his old wryness returning. I'm taking a tax deduction for the full market value. Elizabeth laughed. Of course you are. Some things never change. As Richard departed, Elizabeth rejoined the celebration, helping a group of children plant flowers around the new community. Center sign. Mr. Chun was demonstrating proper watering techniques, while the Ramirez family distributed seedlings they had started in their greenhouse. Later, as the event wound down and the spring afternoon faded toward evening, Elizabeth found herself alone in the garden's small orchard, where apple trees her grandmother's generation had planted now blossomed in the gentle breeze. Mrs. Abernathy found her there. contemplating the white petals drifting like snow in the twilight. "So Richard's moving on," the older woman observed. "And giving back your house, I hear." "News travels fast," Elizabeth replied, unsurprised that Mrs. Abernathy was already informed. "Small neighborhoods have efficient communication systems," Mrs. Abernathy said with a smile. "Better than any technology. Will you move back?" "No," Elizabeth decided, the answer feeling right as she spoke it. "The house will go to the trust. My grandfather built it. My grandmother preserved it. And now it will help preserve the neighborhood." Mrs. Abernathy nodded approvingly. "Full circle, then?" "The Martin legacy continues, just in a different form." "Full circle," Elizabeth agreed, looking out across the garden where new trees stood as promises to the future. The neighborhood had been saved, not by her alone, but by a community coming together around a shared vision. Her initial quest for justice had evolved into something far more meaningful, a model for how communities could shape their own futures, how development could honor history rather than erase it as darkness fell. Neighbors lit the garden lanterns, creating pools of golden light along the pathways. Children played a final game of tag before reluctant parents called them home for dinner. Seniors gathered on benches to watch the first stars appear, telling stories of how the neighborhood had changed and persevered through decades. Elizabeth took it all in the trees her grandfather's generation had planted, the gardens her grandmother had tended, the community spaces she had helped protect. Past, present, and future, all connected in this place where people had decided what mattered was worth fighting for. She had lost a house but found a purpose. She had faced betrayal but discovered strength. She had begun with anger but ended with creation. And as she helped a small girl plant one final sapling in the soft spring earth, Elizabeth Martin knew she had found her way home after all.